Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Apocalypse of the Dragon in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 1. Your Majesty. He was standing in the hall, a short distance from the rookery. There was parchment in his hand. Carved mulberry decorated the timbers. Duncan blinked. This was Ferelden, not Tevinter, and he whirled. Jarath stood behind him, a confused look on his face. They'd been on their way to the rookery when Jarath touched his chest, where the Lyrium warrior had impaled him. His face was pale. That. He looked at Duncan. Happened. I don't. He swallowed, then stepped forward and hugged the other man tightly. You're alive. Your Majesty. The woman who'd spoken earlier was staring at them like they'd gone mad. For the life of him, he couldn't remember her name. Duncan turned towards her. This is going to sound really crazy, but I need to ask you some questions. Chapter 2, beginning again. Nothing changed. Duncan shook his head. It's our world, exactly as we left it. He leaned on the windowsill and gazed at the scene outside. Right down to dreadnoughts just outside our harbor. It's been. Jarath shook his head. His arms were folded across his chest as he leaned against the wall, staring at the ground rather than his usual stance of alertly watching everything. A day. He frowned and gave his friend a concerned look. Are you all right? He stepped forward and put a hand on Jarath's shoulder. His best friend had died. Died saving his life. She won't remember me. Jarath's voice was quiet. Oh. Agatha. Shit. He'd been so focused on finding out if his parents were alive again he'd nearly forgotten what his friend had lost. I'm sorry. The words sounded empty. None of what they'd done had carried over. If Jarath hadn't remembered it all too, he'd have been convinced he'd imagined the entire thing. Jarath nodded, then took a deep breath before straightening his stance and adjusting his breastplate. I'll see to our defenses. He started for the door. Jarath, Duncan grabbed his arm, preventing him from leaving. You. He shook his head. I got you killed, Jarath. I'm not going to pretend that didn't happen. Your Maj. I'm sorry. Duncan swallowed. It was all my fault and. He closed his eyes for a moment. I'm sorry. Duncan, Jarath looked away before shaking his head. Can we table this conversation for some other day? I can't. He took a deep breath. I can't right now. All right. Duncan nodded as he released Jarath's arm. All right. Nothing changed. Leandra gestured haphazardly at the building behind them. And there are a lot of people in that tavern who now think I'm totally nuts. But things had to have changed. Gavrin began pacing. None of this made any sense. Everything still lined up with their memories. Maker, I very nearly destroyed an entire city killing that thing. Something has to have changed. Maybe Kieran. Her eyes widened with horror. No. No, if he'd been removed prior to the dedication, he wouldn't have been able to disrupt that spell in Lides. Gavrin took a deep breath. No, something else must have. He turned toward her. From here, we can be in Denerim in just a few days. We'll find Duncan and Jarath there. Then let's get moving. Leandra started reaching for her pack. A blast from the dreadnought hit the harbor wall, sending debris flying. A warning shot. Jarath shaded his eyes as he surveyed the damage. Like to fire one back. Duncan growled in frustration. He doubted the Cunnery could actually take Denerim with the forces in the harbor, but he doubted that was the plan. They wanted Ferelden off balance and hurting, all the better to present their Kun as a solution to the chaos. Find me a ballista that can. He trailed off as a wall of water suddenly lifted the lead dreadnought, flipping it over. It started to sink. That work? A familiar voice asked. Duncan laughed as he turned to see two figures. One of them was smirking. Duncan gave a small shake of his head at the sight. Rutherford. Your Highness. Gavrin nodded as he and Leandra walked towards them. The guards glanced at Jarath, who waved them back. Leandra hesitated only a moment before shrugging and stepping forward to hug Jarath. She stepped back after a moment and wiped a hand across her eyes. Then she turned toward Duncan. Nothing changed. Any idea why? Duncan raised an eyebrow. Before they could answer, a commotion went up. Rather than continue pressing the attack, the Qunari were retreating. And quickly. Clearly, they hadn't expected to meet with the level of magical resistance Gavarin could throw around. Jarath stepped away to give orders to the soldiers. How did you two even get here so fast? Well. Gavarin shrugged before taking a few steps forward and looking out over the harbor. The dreadnought he'd taken out had all but disappeared beneath the water's surface. Some of the survivors had made it to the other ships. A few of his own ships were on their way to retrieve those that remained. He'd have prisoners, for what little good that did him. We were kind of already in Crestwood. We were kind of eloping when all this happened. Leandra waved a hand. Huh. Duncan nodded. It seemed like a lifetime ago. But you also remember everything. Yeah. Gavarin glanced at where Jarath was walking back toward them. He shook his head, then stepped forward and also hugged the man. Jarath half froze in surprise at the gesture, then awkwardly patted Gavarin's back. Okay. He stepped back, then gave Jarath an apologetic look. Sorry. It's been a weird. Yeah. Jarath just nodded. What happens now? Gavarin and Duncan exchanged a look. He raised an eyebrow slightly and saw Gavarin give a small nod in return. Gavarin was willing to follow his lead. Which meant he was going to have to come up with something resembling a plan to deal with all this shit. Duncan took a deep breath. We figure out what actually happened, and why. He frowned, then shrugged. I'm guessing Logain's probably on his way here as well. He sighed. Let's go somewhere we can speak more privately. Duncan paced his office. Jarath had set Nugget to guard the outside of the door, leaving only the two of them alone with Gavarin and Leandra. Duncan met Gavarin's eyes. Will there be consequences for your help with the Qunari issue? I know your mother was trying for a diplomatic resolution. They shot first. Gavarin shook his head. And there are larger issues here. We were never abducted. He gestured. Remember what Kieran said? The right kids from the wrong world. We didn't reset, we were simply returned because Kieran didn't bring us over at all. So whatever he did in that world worked. Then why do we remember it if it never happened? Jarath leaned against the door. Every now and then he'd rub his chest. It could be because we were linked with Earthamule when everything reset. Leandra raised an eyebrow. Except Jarath wasn't. He was. Gavarin sighed before facing him. You're the one throwing my theories off. If we simply crossed back over, you'd still be dead. If it was because of the link, you wouldn't remember. It's got to be some kind of fade bleed over. Like we experienced a shared dream. That was no dream. Duncan shook his head as he went behind his desk. He leaned on it, staring down at the map of Ferelden as though the answer would magically appear. I agree. Gavarin took over the responsibility of pacing the room. I doubt even Salas could have put together something as long and involved as that. But that's not what I meant. We experienced it in that world, but it remains with us in this one just like a dream remains upon waking. It's real, but only for us. The questions of how and why remain. Yeah. Duncan rubbed his forehead. Okay. But. He went silent as he heard the sound of a scuffle on the other side of the door. He gestured to Jarath. Leandra moved to back Jarath up. Jarath opened the door to find Nugget blocking the path of a familiar-looking man. Logain. Leandra smiled. A look of relief crossed the knight's face. Ah. Good. I'm not the only one who has lost my mind. He glanced down at the red-haired dwarf that was standing in front of him. I told you, they were expecting me. General. Nugget wrinkled his nose at Logain before turning to look at Jarath. Last time he was here the king told me to throw him out and make sure he bounced. Duncan tried not to sigh. Of course, he had to have given that order to the only one of his knights that would take it literally. Nugget was loyal and trustworthy, but not exactly the sharpest arrow in his quiver. "Nugget, stand down." Jarath sighed as he nodded to the dwarf. "Loghain, come in." The tattooed knight stuck his tongue out at the dwarf before entering and shutting the door behind him. Then he looked up at them. "Anyone figured out what happened?" "We are still at the conjecture stage." Gavarin sighed. "Your thoughts?" "There." Loghain took a deep breath, then shrugged awkwardly. "Is something I didn't tell you earlier." He rubbed the back of his neck. Duncan's eyes narrowed. Maybe he would have Nugget throw Loghain out of his office again. "Tell us now." "The warden paid me a visit a few days before." Loghain sighed. He made a move as though he were about to bring his shield up when all of them immediately started staring at him and winced before continuing. "He told me something was going to happen, and when it did, the first thing I needed to do was get a message to him telling him not to interfere and to let Kieran handle things." "You?" Duncan glared. "So that was why the warden and Mythil hadn't involved themselves." "Asshole." "Your Majesty, I..." Loghain gave him an apologetic look. "No." Duncan held up a hand. "No, I understand. Someone like the warden gives you an order, you follow it. Mafaratha's balls." "I have an idea." Leandra looked around the room. "I'm listening." Duncan turned to face her. "Earthamil." Leandra waved a hand. "He linked us to him. Maybe the version here." She swallowed. "Maybe he'd know something. A better option than asking Salas for help, certainly." Gavarin nodded. "Agreed." Duncan turned back to Loghain. "I assume you have a method of communicating with your father." When Loghain nodded, Duncan continued. "All right. Let's get word to him and hope it gets to the warden and Kieran. This happened for a reason." Gavarin looked down at the parchment in his hand, then sighed and tossed it onto the table. "Trouble?" Jarath asked. "Burhan's spies have told my father I'm here. If I don't give him a good explanation very soon, he's going to be on his way. Probably with Mother. Possibly with an army." He shook his head. "I think he figured out why Leandra and I took off and is now really confused as to why we are in Denerim. My concern is that they may think I'm not here entirely of my free will, being that Duncan and I. Last time he and Duncan had interacted in this reality, they'd nearly come to blows. Had the king actually ordered his arrest? He couldn't remember. I've had to explain to several of the guard now that you aren't under arrest and aren't to be considered hostile." Jarath nodded. "Things are going to get complicated." He rubbed his neck, then leaned back before looking up at Jarath. "Can I ask you a question? You want to know what happened when I died?" Jarath raised an eyebrow. "That obvious?" Gavarin sighed and nodded. Kieran had told them Jarath had died. Some part of him wondered if Kieran had been wrong. If Jarath had been taken prisoner or even just knocked out, this would all make a lot more sense. Yet he couldn't see Kieran willingly leaving Jarath in that kind of situation. Duncan and Leandra both already asked. Jarath took a deep breath. He looked away. "I wish I had an answer I could give you. I'm still sorting it out myself." "Then you remember it?" Gavarin straightened. "Every moment." Jarath half closed his eyes. His hand started to move towards his chest, then clenched into a fist and went back to his side. A small chill went through him. The Lyrium warrior would have wanted information. It was unlikely that Jarath's death had been quick. Which meant if they all remembered everything that happened, Jarath remembered being tortured to death. There are spirits that can remove the... No. Jarath's voice was firm, though he didn't raise his head to meet Gavarin's eyes. "Let it be." "I." Gavarin swallowed. "All right. Your Majesty?" a gruff voice asked. "Yes." Duncan blinked when he looked up at where Nugget was leaning in the door. It was past midnight, and he hadn't expected their little meeting to be interrupted. "There is someone here to see you." The dwarf looked confused to have found him in a meeting at all. "Did he say?" Duncan trailed off when a tall man entered behind the dwarf. He looked older than the last time they'd seen him, his build more filled out and his hair shorter. "Kieran." He glanced back at the guard. Thank you. You're dismissed. Nugget blinked but left the room. He looked back up at Kieran. There was no glimmer of recognition in the man's vivid green eyes. Kieran simply nodded, glancing at Loghain before turning back toward him. King Duncan. He inclined his head in a respectful gesture. You called to me. I am here. He took a deep breath, glanced at the others, and turned back to Kieran. What are you hearing in our music? Kieran's eyes widened only slightly before he raised an eyebrow and then slowly nodded again. A familiar strand, interwoven. He frowned, tilting his head a little as his green eyes took in Duncan's measure. Yet I do not recall composing it. You did. Leandra smiled. 16 years ago, in another world. That. Kieran tilted his head. He frowned, then reached out to touch the tip of his finger to Leandra's forehead. Gavrin's eyes widened a little, which meant something magic had likely just happened, but all Leandra did was raise an eyebrow. Kieran stepped back, then gave a small shake of his head. Then he turned toward Loghain and nodded. Explain. Cousin. Loghain shrugged and reached up to rub the back of his neck. You might want to sit down for this. Earthamul's deep voice resonated through the room. Barriers between worlds have broken. They bleed into each other. When the past me reached ahead, he also reached through. You seem less surprised by all this than I would have thought. Leandra leaned on the wall, her arms folded. As confusing as this was, Earthamul and/or Kieran was at least willing to take Loghain's word on the matter. A small part of her was hurt that he hadn't taken hers, and she had to remind herself that while this version of Kieran still called her cousin, they weren't close. If not for their adventure in the other world, she wouldn't even have recognized him in his fully human appearance. We noticed the cracks some time ago. Earthamul nodded. I have been attempting to determine their cause, yet the event has not yet occurred. Was it Fenharel? Gavrin asked, shifting his stance as he said the name. She gave him a smile, and he nodded in response. No. These cracks would be detrimental to him as well. The glow faded, and it was Kieran's voice that continued. Though with this new information, I wonder if the cracks began in this world at all. Your father didn't prevent our recent trip because he thought perhaps past you could do something. Loghain leaned forward in his chair. Did it work? There is no way to be certain. Kieran gave them an appraising look. Perhaps it was only the first move of a longer game, and we do not yet know who or what we face. It is possible that world is secured, but we must concern ourselves with this one. We may want to gather the others anyway. Duncan touched the parchment they'd made notes on earlier. They won't remember, but they may still be helpful. Caleb, for example, is the Sane's Chal of Kirkwall. He could be a useful resource. And Uncle Kells. Gavrin nodded. We may want to tell my parents what happened. Eli, Tissalan, and the others. Loghain took a deep breath. We need to find them. Definitely. Leandra nodded to him before looking back at Kieran. Sentinels. The rebels who went to Starkhaven. Kieran nodded. We can attempt to locate them. And yes, the Inquisitor should be informed. It is likely Fenharel will attempt to contact her. Well. Duncan straightened. I guess she's finally going to get that Fereldan alliance she's been wanting. Maybe that will distract them from being met at Leandra and I. Gavrin smiled hopefully. Good luck. Loghain chuckled. Ruya stared when the Eluvian suddenly sprang into life. She was gesturing at the guards when her son stepped through it, accompanied by Leandra and a tall man she didn't recognize. The Eluvian shut behind them. She took a step forward. Explain. Now. Before Gavrin could open his mouth, she was shaking her head in fury. I told you to stay away from the Eluvians. How did you even get into one? I know you know how dangerous they are. I brought them through, Inquisitor. The man who had accompanied them nodded to her. And who are you? Cullen asked as he stepped to her shoulder. Earthamul. His reply was calm, but his eyes started to glow. I. Ruya stared. It took her a moment to switch gears. Oh. She took several deep breaths. I did not recognize you. Earthamil nodded, then turned his glowing eyes to her son. Listen to their story. I am satisfied it is true. She exchanged a look with her husband, and then arched an eyebrow at their son. Gavarin took a deep breath and began. Chapter 3, Stories. Duncan followed the Inquisitor into the Grand Chantry, Jarath a pace behind. The rest of his honor guard stayed back in the courtyard. Last time he'd been here, he'd been more than a little intimidated. That was before he'd ridden an old god in dragon form against a cult and the forces of the Dread Wolf. Divine Victoria looked shocked to see him accompanying the Inquisitor. Her expression only grew more pronounced as they told her why. And the Warden had some forewarning this was going to happen. The Divine asked. I think it's slightly more likely the warning came from Mythal. Burhan shrugged. It would not be the first time she has had precognition of future events. How we don't know. Duncan spoke up. Both the Inquisitor and the Divine looked a little startled that he did so, and he felt a small stab of irritation. He was king of Ferelden. He has not contacted any of us since our return. Kirin has gone to speak with him, and we are trying other channels as. He saw a raven fly in a nearby open window. A heartbeat later, Kirin was striding towards them, ignoring the shocked looks on various faces. It was hard not to smile. Duncan, Jarath. Kirin nodded to them. Inquisitor, Divine Victoria, Spymaster. My father sends his regards in a grave warning. We believe we have uncovered the goal of whatever caused the cracks. Kirin, I presume. Divine Victoria nodded. I am listening. The cracks are breaking open the Banal Than. It is where Fenharil trapped the Evan Eurus. Kirin frowned. Yet we have confirmed he is not the source of the cracks. Father believes he will reach out to the Inquisitor soon. Why? Divine Victoria asked. She's his friend. Duncan shrugged before glancing at where the Inquisitor stood. He'd likely have made off with the staff if he hadn't been trying, in his way, to protect Gavarin. Duncan turned back to Kirin. Any luck? Kirin smiled. Loghain led me right to it. I returned him to Denerim before coming here. His smile faded. Father will guard the Banal Than, but if the cracks grow too wide there will be little he can do to prevent their escape. If we find the source before the prison breaks, we can stop it from opening. Things will get much worse if it opens. Define worse. Duncan asked, and almost immediately regretted it. The Dread Wolf had broken the world to deal with these things. The elves that bend knee may survive. Kirin twitched a shoulder. I doubt any others will. My parents and I will do what we can to stop this. He hesitated a moment, and then his eyes glowed. We may also know who is behind this. You do. Inquisitor Ruya blinked. History records us as 7. Earthamil turned to face her. Yet once, we were 9. 9. Ruya nodded. Your father said something similar when he joined the Inquisition. Virtues, they called us. Command, duty, knowledge, faith, inspiration, wisdom, love, honor, and compassion. Compassion. Like coal. Divine Victoria started to smile, and it became a frown quickly. Which were you? I am inspiration. The muse. Duncan nodded. Dumat was command, Zazzikal duty, Toth knowledge, Andoril faith, Razikael love, Luzakan honor. You encountered all that is left of wisdom in the Vir Direthera. My last sibling was compassion. The elves called her the Lantern. Why would compassion free the Evan Eurus? Burhan asked. Why did beauty start a blight? Earthamil twitched a shoulder. We were twisting before Tevinter. Compassion in a time of pain. Perhaps she sees death as the only peace remaining, or perhaps she wishes all to suffer as the Evan Eurus have. I remember being mad, but I can make little sense of it now. He flicked his eyes toward where Burhan stood. The former warden didn't seem happy at the presence of the former archdemon. It all seemed a reasonable thing to do at a time. Duncan folded his arms. Ferelden will be happy to assist the Inquisition in dealing with this matter. He raised an eyebrow at Earthamil. How are you coming on gathering the others? I took Gavarin and Leandra to Kirkwall. The glow faded, and Kirin glanced at the Inquisitor. May I borrow Commander Kells? She'd known the man standing on the other side of the desk for her entire life. And yet after recent events, it felt almost like meeting him for the first time. Caleb smiled when he saw her and Gavrin enter. Leandra. Hello, cousin. He stood and walked over to greet her with a kiss on the cheek. Lord Rutherford. I thought you both in Orlais. Sanes Chalhawk. Gavrin bowed. We've come because we may need your help. I am not hiding either of you from your parents. Caleb's eyes widened, and he immediately began shaking his head. Gavrin laughed. Believe it or not, that is the least of our concerns at the moment. You might want to sit down for this. Leandra shrugged. Duncan sighed at the report Agatha gave him. Burhan said there had been executions, but... He shook his head, swallowing past the lump that had risen in his throat. I hoped he was wrong. I have no idea which were executed. Agatha folded her arms. They may not have even been your sentinels. But the blades match the style of those used at the Temple of Mythal. He looked her over. She raised an eyebrow at him, and he shrugged. 16 years in the past, you teamed up with one of these sentinels and blew up the Dread Wolf. She stared back at him, one corner of her mouth turned up slightly. Was this before or after you hit your head, Your Majesty? It all made sense at the time. As much as he liked Agatha, he couldn't quite help missing the more carefree girl she'd once been. You also teamed up with one to write dirty words on my face while I was asleep. In Elvish? Yeah. Agatha nodded. That sounds like me. She frowned, and then glanced at the door before looking back at him. Her voice was quieter when she spoke again. Any of what happened explain why General Gilmore has been acting a little off. Jaroth seemed his normal stoic self but trust his spymaster to pick up on things. A sigh escaped him as he wondered what to tell her. Finally, he shrugged. I got him killed. What? She took a step forward before glancing at the door. Her eyes were wide. A Lyrium warrior, like Lord Fenris of Kirkwall. His fists clenched at the memory. The rest of us remember winning. He gets to remember dying. And falling in love, only to be left with a woman that didn't remember loving him back. His best friend's heart had been torn apart twice. Give him a bit of time to deal with that. Poor guy. Agatha nodded. That must. She sighed. Well, shit. She squared her shoulders. King Trian isn't sure he believes this, but he said he's got your back. I also filled my parents in. Good. At least his best resources were used to weird shit happening. We may need their network. Yep. Viscount Varric shook his head, then glanced at where the hawks had arranged themselves around the room. Those are definitely your kids. Her father sighed before looking up at Leandra. I admit, a part of me hoped to keep you out of all this. Uncle Gabriel blinked. Then it's all true. It may be. Her mother nodded. We've been looking into these cracks, trying to trace them. They share some similarities with the Eluvian network, but uncontrolled. Leandra folded her arms. Kieran notified his father. Has he spoken with you? Her parents exchanged a look before Merrill nodded. Yes. And I'll be on my way in the morning to assist Morrigan. Carver is staying to keep an eye on Kirkwall, and I'll be returning as soon as I can. She frowned. Considering the city's history, there is a chance that the physical origin of the cracks will be here. Caleb sighed, and turned towards Varric. Is it too late to dash? No quitting. Varric immediately shook his head. I don't get to quit, you don't get to quit. We need to talk to Sala next. Gavrin glanced at Leandra. She nodded. Introducing Sala to Kieran could be interesting, even if they were 16 years worth of different people. Fenris spoke up. I sent a message to her. Though she may be hesitant about being pulled away from her work. Caleb. Leandra turned to face him. He shook his head. I'm not sure what you expect me to do, but I'm fairly confident I'm of the most use to you here. And if Varric doesn't kill me for running off. He glanced over at where his wife was giving him a concerned look. Analyze will. He sighed. I'm no warrior, Leandra. True. She smiled. Even in the past, words were always your best weapon. It's your voice we're going to need, not your crossbow. I will do whatever I can. He saluted. There is still one issue. Carver stood, folding his arms. His eyes went from Leandra to Gavrin and back again. Anything else you two want to tell me? Leandra swallowed. Jarath looked over the report his lieutenant handed him. Repairs had been completed, and Qunari forces were at least partially withdrawn. It was too much to hope that the war was over, but the Qunari had apparently realized something else was happening. If he thought he could trust an alliance, he'd have suggested one. He handed the parchment back and started toward Duncan's office. Loghain. Jarath. The knight fell into step with him. Are you all right? I'm alive. He shrugged. The question was starting to grow tiresome. Not what I meant. Loghain held up a hand and stopped them both. He gave Jarath a worried look, then sighed before gesturing at the window. Kieran is looking for the sentinels. Elias. He looked down at his hands. What the hell do you say to a woman you let fall to her death? Jarath took a deep breath. Loghain has his own burdens to bear. He put a hand on the younger man's shoulder. She won't remember. I do. Every moment. And you remember Agatha. At least. Loghain folded his arms. I'm a callous and selfish bastard. But you're not, and that's cause for some concern. You're a bastard, Loghain. Jarath mirrored his stance. But you only pretend to be callous and selfish. He shook his head. I told Agatha that it wasn't real. That when it was fixed we'd be different people and... He sighed. I should have listened to myself. Love is worth taking the risk. Loghain met his eyes. And it is worth the regrets. Maybe. Jarath sighed, then gave Loghain a considering look. How many know who your real father is? Until recently. Loghain shrugged. Only my mother, Erlina, and my fellow Dragonsworn. He rubbed his neck, then frowned. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, then exhaled. All right, cards on the table. I'm also host to a spirit. Abomination is the common word. Explain. Jarath raised an eyebrow. He sent a quick glance over his shoulder to confirm there was no one within earshot. Before their trip to the past, the confession might have sent him reaching for his blade. He's not. Loghain took a deep breath. He doesn't take control of me. He just helps. Makes me a little stronger, keep going a little longer. Helps me heal and a few other tricks. Loghain had been noted a fair warrior, but their trip to the past had made it clear the man had been holding back in the tournaments and duels. The man was Dragonsworn, after all. What kind of tricks? I can. Loghain hesitated. I can phase through things. Like. He had to stop his hand from going to his chest. He could still feel it, like ice driven through his flesh, pain driving almost all else from his mind. Like the Lyrium warrior. I killed him. Loghain nodded, the words quiet. The bastard who killed you. An odd thing to find myself thanking someone for. Jarath shook his head. But thank you. You said you had a plan. Ruya folded her arms and tapped her fingers against the cool metal of the prosthetic arm. She couldn't quite bring herself to look at the man standing in her quarters. He hadn't been there a few moments ago. Behind her, Cullen tensed, but said nothing. My plan required certain things to take place before the Banalthan ruptures. Salas sighed. He clasped his hands behind his back, the same familiar stance he'd assumed during their many conversations. It seemed a lifetime ago. I intended to deal with them one at a time. Unfortunately, with these cracks, that is no longer an option. And what happens after? She walked toward the map hanging on the wall, looking at where borders had been erased and redrawn over the years. Salas walked forward until he stood at her side. Don't know. He took a deep breath. Ruya, All right. She squared her shoulders. Ruya. You saved my son's life. The hand she had full control over clenched into a fist, and she lifted her head to meet his eyes. I will work with you. But I will not forget that you used me, and you betrayed me. She took a deep breath. Let's go save the world. Again. My nephew. Otwin stared at her. Traveled through time. He shook his head. There was a time I wouldn't have believed it. I've done it, Ruya said. And I'm not sure I believe it. She looked at each of her brothers. Otwin had ink smudged on his nose, and there was a child's blue paint handprint on the bottom of his tunic. He was pacing, gesturing wildly when he spoke. Lucas leaned calmly against the wall, eyes watchful. He was a full hand shorter than Otwin, and thinner. If it weren't for the red hair, it would have been difficult to guess all three of them were related. Salas says what is going on here has some similarities to the breach. You mean Fenharel? Lucas narrowed his eyes. Ruya. She sighed at her brothers. Over 20 years she'd been the Inquisitor, and they were still as overprotective as ever. I know. And no, I don't trust him. He used the Inquisition and me for his own ends once, and I have no doubt given the opportunity he will do the same again. But he also saved my son's life, and I can't forget that either. Lucas stared at her for a moment, and then nodded. I'll have a word with Cullen about available forces. These mirrors of yours. Salas has promised that Inquisition forces may move through them safely. That. Lucas started shaking his head. She knew he trusted her, but magic in general still made him leery. Had he not been the heir, he would have been a Templar. Which meant he was not going to find their safeguard reassuring in the slightest. Part of her wondered if she should even tell him, but Lucas had a way of knowing when she was lying to him. If they were to succeed in this, she needed his trust. And Earthamule said he'll make sure that promise is kept. So. Lucas took a deep breath. I just have to trust two beings that very nearly destroyed the world. Well. Otwin ran a hand through his shaggy hair. This should be all sorts of fun. He was halfway down the hall when three figures stepped into his path. Gavarin shook his head and went through a mental list of all the monsters he'd prefer to be facing at the moment. It was fairly long. He sighed at his cousins. Gossi, Telena, Reyna. He started to take a step back and realized there was someone else standing behind him. Kylie. With the divine present, he should have known all four of them would be here and planned accordingly. Now he was both trapped and outnumbered. Gavarin. Big brother. Kylie linked her arm through his. Her smile was sweet and friendly, and she went up on tiptoes to give him a sisterly kiss on the cheek. The grip on his arm felt like a steel trap had just snapped shut. Telena Marland took his other arm and touched her head to his shoulder affectionately as she and Kylie started strolling toward an open door, dragging him along. Things are happening. Reyna Montaliet closed the door as soon as he was inside the room. She gave him a pouting look that almost immediately made him start to feel guilty and apologetic. He'd almost prefer thumbscrews. And no one will tell us what is going on. Goswina Trevelyan smiled sweetly. Her voice way light and airy, careless with an Antivan accent. She was decked out in lace and jewels, and her feathered fan twirled about absently. Those guileless, doe-like blue eyes made her seem so harmless. You and the very single king of Ferelden are suddenly friends. You're traveling through the Eluvian network. Kylie guided him into a chair, casually taking his staff out of his hand and passing it over to Telena before he realized what was happening. Yeah. He wasn't going to be getting that back until they had what they wanted. Mother is writing missives to everyone she's ever met. Reyna folded her arms. She'd inherited her mother's features. Father has been sent on a secret mission for Uncle Cullen. Telena narrowed her eyes. And the tall man who brought you through the Eluvian is apparently no less than Earthamule himself. Goswina punctuated her words with a flick of her fan. So talk. All four of them said simultaneously. I'm expected in. Gavarin started shaking his head. And the sooner you cooperate and tell us everything we want to know, you'll be on your way. Reyna smiled, the same charming smile her mother Josephine used to get whatever she wanted out of pretty much anyone. That's not going to work on me. He shook his head at her. All four of them just smirked at him. He sighed and leaned his head back to stare at the ceiling. All right, what do you want to know? What's going on? Kylie narrowed her eyes. Same thing that's been going on since before you were born. The world is in danger and we are trying to save it. What changed recently? Telena tilted her head. We got dragged through a rift in time and recently returned. Your brother's gone crazy again. Reina glanced at Kylie before turning back to him. What's really going on? No, he's telling the truth. Kylie frowned. It happened to Mother once before, remember? How'd it happen this time? Earthamil. Sort of. It's a long story. He sighed. Things changed, and now we've got to figure out how much and how to stop it. Can I go now? Nope. Goswina smiled. Not until you promise to introduce us to the King of Ferelden. Goswina, you stabbed his best friend with a fork. Gavrin shook his head. But you are going to tell him about us. Reina narrowed her eyes. Yes. Gavrin nodded. Duncan definitely needed to be warned. How did Kells take the news? Duncan fell into step with Gavrin as they walked from the Eluvian room. He'd only met Commander Kells a couple times. Reconciling the Inquisition field commander with the young lieutenant had been a bit difficult. Commander Kells had a bit of grey in his beard. He was alright until I got to the second time we kidnapped him, and I decided not to tell him about the deep roads or the whole declaring war on Tevinter thing. Gavrin shrugged. Father sent him with Kieran to look over the additional defenses the warden has recovered. He opened the door and gestured for Duncan and Jarath to follow him. Oh, before I forget, my sister is here with our cousins and you're, ER. He sighed. Eligible bachelor status is very interesting for them. I think I met one of your cousins. Duncan raised an eyebrow before looking over his shoulder at Jarath. There had been an incident at a state dinner. Didn't she stab you with a fork? I think she was aiming for the assassin. Jarath shrugged. My sister is also interested. Gavrin narrowed his eyes. So, let me take this opportunity to dash. Remind me that you can break a city apart if sufficiently annoyed. Duncan smiled. That pretty much covers it. Gavrin nodded. I am technically engaged. To a woman you can't pick out of a room. Gavrin shrugged. Do you remember her name? Duncan narrowed his eyes. Shut up. Burhan walked down the stairs from the rookery. It seemed there were more of them every day. At least little of the news had been bad. Salas's spies had sent information, though he couldn't help but feel just a small twinge of pride at how much of it his spies already knew. He unlocked his office and stepped inside, only to stop short. His eyes widened, and then he shook his head and smiled at the man standing in his office. Maker. You haven't aged a day. He ran a hand through his grey hair. The rest of us should be so lucky. Jarath nodded. It has its downsides. He held out a hand. Burhan. He caught the hand, then pulled the smaller man into a hug. He chuckled at the annoyed sigh that resulted. Some things, at least, hadn't changed. I'm hugging an archdemon. And not getting stabbed. Don't press your luck. Jarath stepped back, but he smiled. It is good to see you again, Lethalin. I just wish. He sighed and nodded as he felt his earlier good mood vanish. Jarath hadn't sent a messenger. He'd come in person. You're here with bad news. Unless we can prevent the event that caused the cracks, there is no way to stop them. There was a flicker of something in Jarath's eyes. A slight glow behind the vivid green that reminded him that while Jarath might still look like the young elf he'd known all those years ago, he wasn't. The damage cannot be undone. But you know who causes them. He moved behind his desk, grabbing parchment and a pen as he sat down. Jarath nodded. I have been seeking her for 30 years, Burhan. I have succeeded only in driving her from Weishaupt. With the mangy hound active, she could afford to simply hide and wait. And she has had well over 1,000 years to perfect that tactic. Slowly, he set the pen back down. Learning the first warden had been possessed had been almost as disturbing as learning that there was another archdemon-like being running around. Fenharil gave her an opening. I came into a chess game halfway, and I cannot see the entire board. Jarath shook his head. Even if I stop her now, it may already be too late. The veil is failing. In time, the Evan Eurus will be freed. I am sorry. It's been well over a decade since the last report of a Darkspawn attack. Burhan folded his arms. His old friend had successfully stopped at least 4 apocalypses. And that was only the ones he knew about. You've done more than your share. My last plan didn't work. Jaratha's voice was quiet. Sending the kids back. Burhan raised an eyebrow. It was a damn good try, from what I heard. It changed nothing. Jarath leaned on the wall. It didn't even save Alistair and Cathiel. That was not your fault. None of us saw that coming. Burhan immediately shook his head. He still felt a pang of grief at the mention of their former comrades. Twice now he'd caught himself about to call Duncan by Alistair's name. Maker, it's only been recently we learned who was even responsible for that. He took a deep breath. And if their story is true, it did work. Just not in this world. This is the one concerning me at the moment. Burhan nodded. Over 3 decades, and here we are gearing up to save the world again. There had been a time he'd have been picking up his hammer. It hung on a wall in the Grand Cathedral, a memento to remind people that the Divine had personally fought alongside those that had stopped a blight. He gestured at himself. To paraphrase Varric, it's possible I'm getting too old for this shit. He leaned back in his chair. Agatha, Lenore's daughter, she's good. Possibly better than I was at her age. High praise. Jarath nodded. He straightened, squaring his shoulders as his voice became more businesslike. Information is your line of work. Find me something to stab. He turned and started for the door rather than simply vanishing. That was appreciated. Having people fade out of sight right in front of you never stopped being disturbing. It is good to see you again. Burhan smiled. One last war, brother. Jarath glanced over his shoulder to return the smile. And in war. Victory. Chapter 4, Gathering Forces. I have arranged a meeting with Empress Selene. Ruya leaned on the war table. She didn't miss Duncan's wince. King Alistair had made a promising start toward improving relations between Ferelden and Orlais. Unfortunately, Selene's actions after his death had undone most of that work. Ferelden cannot do this alone, Your Majesty. My father's ashes weren't cold when she sent people to annex Haven. Duncan shook his head. She made a mental note to have Warden Commander Setida present at the meeting. The dwarven woman could provide a moderating influence on Duncan, and as a paragon had enough standing to hold her own against Selene. Gavrin just sent word from Kirkwall. Mynov spoke up. Viscount Varric has pledged his full support. Lord Lucas has also sent word from Ostwick. The Duke isn't sure he believes, but your brother was apparently quite persuasive. Kal Hirol stands with us. Duncan nodded. That alliance, at least, had never been in doubt. Sometimes it was difficult to remember that Kal Hirol and Ferelden were separate countries. And Paragon Braska has pledged his full support as well. Warden Commander Setida is also with us. Good to know. She trailed off as the door opened. Duncan immediately smiled at the tall man who entered. Kieran. Duncan. Kieran nodded to him before looking toward her. You know the group killing slavers on the border between Tevinter and Navarra? Yes. Ruya nodded. She'd sent people to investigate several times, but they'd come up empty-handed. Some had theorized that Salas's people were responsible, but he'd confirmed Burhan's assertion otherwise. I found him. Kieran gestured, and an elven man followed him into the room. He was dressed in sentinel armor, and his valislan marked him as Mythals. She narrowed her eyes just a little, noting he bore an odd resemblance to Salas. Duncan's eyes widened as a huge smile came to his face. Tissalan. His smile started to fade. He hesitated a moment, glancing at the door, then his shoulders slumped. And the others? When Kieran shook his head, Duncan closed his eyes for a moment. Damn. Duncan gestured for Tissalan to follow him into his office. Kieran told you what happened. You traveled to an alternate past, and there encountered me? Tissalan clasped his hands behind his back and watched Duncan calmly. That more or less sums it up. Duncan nodded. That he was a complete stranger to the man in front of him was harder to bear than he'd anticipated. He hadn't realized just how much he really had started thinking of Tassalin as a grandfather figure. I've seen you in action. It was pretty damn impressive. He took a deep breath. I'd like to make you an offer. You have enemies that require killing. Tassalin nodded. His face remained expressionless. Tassalin had always been stoic, but not seeing the twinkle of humor in those gray eyes hurt a little. This man had lost the last family he had. Yes, but that's not the offer. Duncan folded his arms. Their Tassalin had fought alongside them, a loyal friend and trusted mentor. That debt, he could repay. You were a teacher once. In that past, you taught us some, enough for me to know as good as you are in the field it's a waste of your talents. He gestured at some parchment on the table. The Arl of Denerim's manor stands vacant. He raised his head, meeting Tassalin's eyes. I'd like to give it to you, to use as a school. Something flickered in the gray eyes. The first trace of emotion he'd seen on the other man's face since meeting him again. A tiny glimmer of life. Tassalin raised an eyebrow. You wish me to train warriors? Dirthiana and Azalin. I wish you to teach. Duncan shook his head. I saw what your people tried to do for Lord Hendry. The thought of all that being lost quite frankly makes me sick. He squared his shoulders as he held Tassalin's gaze with his own. The last Minan of the Silonvayan. The school is yours. What you teach, and whom, is your decision. For a moment, Tassalin stood there quietly. Then he nodded and pressed his palms together before bowing. I accept your offer, my king. When he straightened again, some of the emptiness had left his eyes. I will require books, parchment, and training weapons. You'll have your own quartermaster and considerable funds. Duncan smiled. Lenora Mel may be your best source for books. I will also need to return briefly to Starkhaven. To Starkhaven. Duncan blinked. A small smile came to Tassalin's face, and for a moment he looked like the same man he'd been in the other world. Hidden is not the same as lost. You really have gone mad this time, haven't you? The sound of the familiar voice made him wince. Duncan turned to see Salif Gilmore staring at him from the doorway of his office, disappointment all over her face. She wore her full chantry robes, clean and neatly pressed. Mother Salif. He bowed. I was not expecting you. No. Because sense and reason aren't expected in these halls. She folded her arms. You really expect anyone to believe this cockamamie story you've got my brother parroting? Salif. He felt a trace of irritation when he heard a note of whining in his own voice. Even before she'd become a chantry mother, Salif had mothered everyone. Are you really that desperate to live up to your father and grandfather's legends? Salif pointed at him. It's all right to just rule Ferelden, you know. It's enough, really. You're out of line. He drew himself up. Don't play king at me. She glared. I changed your diapers. Her eyes softened only slightly. You've done a lot, Duncan. You don't have to keep on this. It's real, Salif. It happened. He gestured. Would I have Gavrin Rutherford and Leandra Hawke in the guest wing for anything less than the end of the world? She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. It can't be true. The veil was repaired. The Maker sent the herald. He would not allow demons to undo that work. They aren't exactly demons. Duncan took a deep breath. Kiran Dash. It started a blight. She was glaring again. And you're going to drag my brother into this mess. No one drags Jaroth anywhere. Duncan shook his head. They were a king and a general, and all she saw were two little boys with skinned knees. I pity anyone stupid enough to try. Do you have any idea how much trouble you'll bring down on yourself with this? Salif's eyes were wet. Does he have to die before you stop to think? He felt his blood go cold. Jaroth had died for him, because he'd acted without thinking. That he was back was a miracle. I don't want him hurt any more than you do, Salif. He's my best friend. And you will follow in your father's footsteps. A tear came from her eye. even if it means he follows in ours. She turned and stormed out of his office. Duncan sighed, then jumped when another voice entered the room. I'm sorry. He turned to see a slight elven man leaning against the wall. Something about the man was vaguely familiar. Excuse me. Your parents, and Sir Gilmore. I would have saved them if I could. I am sorry I could not. The man nodded. Vivid green eyes flicked over Duncan as though calmly taking his measure. And sorry as well, for the burden you must now bear. His eyes widened. Those eyes. The same as Kieran's. Duncan shifted to give a respectful bow. You're the warden. He swallowed. Forgive me, my lord. I did not recognize you. I am no lord. A small laugh came from the elven man. And this is your castle? He shook his head. The cracks spread far. They may even be what weakened the seals on Corypheus's prison. Stopping the event now will not undo the damage, but it will enable us to fix it. The Formless One. Duncan swallowed. He hesitated a moment, wondering just what Kieran had told his father. It said Varla was its apprentice. I had wondered where she got her orb. The warden twitched a shoulder. Mythil has it now. And you helped Kieran recover another. Thank you. Duncan turned as Jaroth entered the office. He probably should have locked the door. Or perhaps he should have a discussion with his knights about what guard duty actually entailed. Your Majesty. Jaroth raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised to find him meeting with someone. It occurred to Duncan that the warden probably hadn't announced himself to the guards. And any Ferelden guard who knew who the warden was certainly wouldn't have even tried stopping him. He half turned, gesturing at the elven man. Jaroth, this is... Then he blinked as he stared at the warden, abruptly remembering what the man's actual name was. My namesake. The warden nodded. A pleasure. Jaroth's eyes went wide, and he bowed. It's an honor to meet you, my lord. I'm not a lord. The warden rolled his eyes. I got out of that whole Arl thing years ago. He nodded to Duncan. You will not be alone in this, King of Ferelden. Call, and we will answer. He stepped back and vanished into the shadows. He found himself leaning on the edge of his desk, then gave a small shake of his head. It's funny. Duncan. Jaroth raised an eyebrow. We ran around with Earthamil for months and... He took a deep breath and laughed a little. And yet somehow meeting the warden was different. Jaroth gave one of his rare smiles. I remember father telling the story about the warden and your mother breaking him out of Fort Dricken. All of them stark naked. Duncan started laughing. I know the one. Pella. Wynne turned to look at the Qunari woman. My husband has gone stupid again. I'll fetch the rope. Pella shrugged as she stood up and set aside her knitting. He watched her move across the room, her hips swaying in the flowing skirt. His wife did have excellent taste. Loghain rubbed his forehead before looking back at Wynne. This conversation was going about as well as he'd anticipated. You know, I am actually being serious here. You lead Gwerin's military. Wynne folded her arms. The sleeveless tunic she wore showed off her muscles in a manner that would have ordinarily occupied his full attention. Her eyes were sharp. And normally, you do a halfway decent job. Are you suggesting that the task is more than you can handle? Loghain raised an eyebrow at her, letting the corner of his mouth turn up in a challenging expression. Pella. Wynne's eyes narrowed as she let her arms fall to her sides. She took a step toward him. A wise man would start running at this point. Got it here. Pella held up a coil of rope, then glanced at Loghain. You know, you really did just sort of ask for it right there. He just smiled as Wynne grabbed him by the front of his tunic and started dragging him toward the bed. You can't really believe this. Salah glared. His hopes that she'd remain oblivious to all the recent events had been dashed. Some demon hauls you into the Fade End. It wasn't the Fade, Salah. Jaroth shook his head. At least she hadn't dragged their mother into the conversation. Part of him hoped his mother in the other world hadn't learned of his death. And he is not a demon. It started a blight. Salah folded her arms. In blackest envy were demons born. She was in full chantry mode. Exactly what he didn't need right now. And the warden? He raised an eyebrow at her. Is he a demon? The warden died, and a demon took his place. Salah took a deep breath. It was disappointing to hear that line from her. Others parroted it, but the notion that his sister was that small-minded annoyed him. She should have known better. Just because you were named after him. Salah. He couldn't help but wonder how she'd react to know that the warden had been in the palace just an hour ago. For a brief moment, he had the childish urge to inform her. He shoved it aside. He was 30, not 13. Even if to his sister, he was still 4.5. Bad enough you risk your life. Must you also risk your soul? Salah put a hand on his shoulder. She brushed a bit of imaginary dust from him. You're my brother, Jarath. You. I died. His voice was quiet. He hadn't meant to say it out loud. What? She blinked. When we were taken back. I died. He could still feel the sensation of the lyrium warrior clutching his heart. I died. I remember it. Jarath. Her eyes went huge. And when the darkness closed in, it wasn't the Maker who was with me. Another presence in his mind, apologetic and comforting, blocking the pain from reaching him, keeping him firm. The lyrium warrior's eyes had gone dark when he'd stopped screaming. He met his sister's eyes, and knew she'd never understand. It wasn't the fade, Salah. It had to be. She shook her head. On blackened wings does deceit take flight. She took another deep breath. 3 times I've come to Dinarum, terrified you'd be dead before I arrived. You should have married Anya and... She left me, in case you've forgotten. Jarath pushed her hand off his shoulder. I'm not a child, Salah. And I don't recall asking for your guidance. No. You never ask. You just follow without question. No matter how much trouble he leads you to. And our bloodline will die with you. If it's children you want, I'm sure you can head to the Pearl and find some dash. He was cut off by her slapping him. They stared at each other for several heartbeats. Salah spoke first. You have a duty to this family. I have a duty to my king. He narrowed his eyes. You chose your path. And I chose mine. He turned and walked away. He looked up when the door opened, and then started. Haran. Next to Gavrin, Leandra's eyes widened. Salas nodded. Delenn. Your mother has told me some of what befell you. I have a few questions. I'm sure you do. Gavrin nodded. He narrowed his eyes. In the other world, he'd bested Salas. This version didn't know that, but that part didn't matter. He'd bested the Dread Wolf. It made meeting Salas's eyes a lot easier. In that alternate world, you tried going after my father to force my hand. I have difficulty imagining circumstances that would have led me to do harm to General Cullen. Salas frowned. Gavrin smiled. Well, considering trying resulted in you getting your ass handed to you by no less than your own little brother, I think we'll let bygones be. Then you know. Salas actually looked surprised. Then again, that news had surprised them all when Kieran had mentioned it. Kieran had been surprised they didn't already know. In retrospect, however, it was almost surprising to realize none of them had ever once thought to ask. Leandra shrugged. The Kieran of the past made a pretty good point. We remember everything that happened, everything said by your agents that we captured and interrogated. She leaned back, a trace of smirk on her face. And everything Tassalin told us of you over a considerable span of time. And you don't. Gavrin's own smile widened. Now, you had some questions. For a moment, Salas just looked at them. Then he smiled. Jarath walked down the row of recruits, looking over the drill. He took a second look, then tilted his head and walked back to where his lieutenant was observing. Clara Howe gave him an amused look. He narrowed his eyes at her, then glanced back at the row of recruits. General. She raised an eyebrow. Clara hadn't been a recruit. She'd walked brazenly into his office 4 years ago and informed him she was joining the King's Guard. He'd been about to throw her out until she'd given her name, meeting his eyes defiantly when she did. Her uncle had started the work of restoring her family's name. She intended to finish it. He glanced at the recruits again. The crossbows seemed to be working out. Her nose wrinkled a little. The rate of fire is barely a third of what a halfway decent archer can manage. Yes, but they are getting a reasonable amount of accuracy and penetration within minutes of picking one up. He glanced at her, his eyes flicking to the bow slung over her shoulder. Good archers almost have to be bred. I suppose if Kal Hirol can keep us supplied with the blasted things. She looked back at the group. I'm going to wash out the two on the left and probably the one who is standing by the weapon rack again pretending to be picky about his weapon rather than actually doing the drill. Good choice. He looked over the group again, then tilted his head. That is going to leave us with entirely women. She blinked, then looked them over, eyes tallying the numbers. Huh. She shrugged. Shit, we are going to have to reorder the barracks. Bad enough the Divine carries on an affair with an elven savage, but she lets their heretical cult fester. Isn't your mother an elf? Sister Eliza raised an eyebrow at Salah. My mother is a good Andrastian. Salah glared. Then she sighed. Why couldn't those boys just see reason for once? And they've turned the king away. And your brother? The Grand Cleric asked. Can you sway him? I tried. She sighed. And I will keep trying. He's a good man, he has just been taught to put his duty to king before his duty to the maker. The Grand Cleric nodded. Keep trying, child. Perhaps they can both yet be returned to grace. He looked up at the sound of boots stomping their way toward his office and winced. That could be only one person. He'd been dreading this. A few moments later, his sister slammed his door open. Wynne narrowed her eyes. Since when do you and my husband get along? Duncan chuckled. Trust his sister to have her concerns prioritized. How much has he told you? Considering Pella and I tied him to the bed and questioned him for 6 hours. Mischief danced in her eyes. Gah. Duncan winced. Wynne. I presume everything. She sat down on the corner of his desk, exactly the way she knew he hated. Did you really ride off on the back of a dragon? Wynne folded her arms. Crazy stuff. But with folks working together, we might just have a shot. She gestured at the young elven woman that had accompanied her. This is Melina. Carinal and Valia's eldest. She's gonna study with that Desalin fellow. Ultimately, that's up to Desalin. Duncan nodded. While he doubted Desalin would object, he had promised the man authority over who and what he taught. Ferelden's first university was already growing, in no small part due to the sheer novelty of its headmaster. I've given him the old Arl of Denerim's estate to use as a school. Well, it's burned down a few times. Wynne shrugged. Either she was taking things in stride, or Loghain actually had done an adequate job of explaining everything. The neighbors should be used to it by now. The neighbors were already complaining. At least most of the complaints weren't about the number of elves that the university had attracted. I'm considering moving them out to Crestwood. Get them a bit more room. She was silent for a moment, looking away. Her voice was soft when she spoke. You got to see them again. He didn't have to ask who she meant. Father. I spoke to Mother using one of the communication crystals. What? She sighed. I don't even know what to ask. He yelled at me about my language. He looked down at his hands. I told the Kirin of that world everything that happened. He promised he'd do all he could to save them. You trust him? Wynne looked up at him. Yes. Said that pretty fast. Wynne raised an eyebrow. Might have hesitated if you'd been talking about the one from this world, but my answer would have been the same. He shook his head. The being that had once nearly destroyed Ferelden might now be its greatest ally. This war may be bigger than just the Qunari. Wynne straightened up, and smirked. Don't worry. Your little sister is here to save you. Loghain turned over command of Gwerin's soldiers to me while he rides with the order. I'm sorry. Jarath looked up to see Salah in the door of his room. He sighed. I know. She entered and touched her hand to his scarred cheek. I just worry. I know that too. You've been fighting his battles for him all his life, Jarath. Salah sighed and put her hand on his arm. And you didn't fight for Anya. You don't fight for yourself. You can have your own life. Salah, I'm a general. Every soldier in Ferelden reports to me. He put his hand atop hers. I haven't been just his bodyguard in years. I know. But you're still my little brother. She smiled. And in a way, so is he. She sighed. I hear he went to speak with the Divine. And the Inquisitor. To discuss your... She shook her head. The Grand Cleric does not approve of young Rutherford being here. His association with that. Gavrin's good people. Jarath. I trust him. Jarath patted her hand. And you know how few I say that of. I suppose. She gave him a dubious look. He is the son of Andrastes Herald. We should ensure he is not lured away from the Maker. But that just makes its presence a greater threat. It. Jarath raised an eyebrow. That demon. The one that calls itself an old god. He felt anger heat his blood. Kirin is not an it. Jarath shook his head and stepped away from her. Nor is he a demon. Jarath. Salah. He made himself take several deep breaths, trying to put the anger back under control. Get out of my room. Jarath. Get. He said the words through clenched teeth. Out. Ruya took a deep breath before exchanging a look with Josephine. Negotiations weren't going well. Ferelden and Orlais were not allies, and it was clear that all the Empress saw when she looked at Ferelden's king was a young boy in need of manners. Terna Mactyr handled most of the diplomatic affairs for Ferelden, but the woman was old and had recently taken ill, leaving the king to speak for himself. If it wasn't for Setida, the two countries might already have been at war again. A nagging little voice in her mind was starting to express regrets about having helped Selene keep her throne. King Duncan may have been a skilled warrior and a good leader for Ferelden, but here in Val Royeaux it was clear he was far out of his depth. By refusing to play the great game, he was playing right into Selene's hands. Dorian was doing his best, but thanks to Selene's manipulations it was clear Duncan had already alienated the Archon. She was trying to figure out how she and Josephine could salvage the situation when Selene riled Duncan yet again. I won't deny Orlais and Tevinter have contributed much to Thedas. Duncan squared his shoulders. Slavery, blight, the subjugation of the elves, questionable fashion choices, and abusive mage circles. Why, it only took Tevinter 2 centuries to put down a blight, and Orlais 4 decades. Young man. Selene drew herself up. I remember my history, Empress. Perhaps you should remember yours. When the Maker chose his prophet, it wasn't among the perfumed nobles that he searched. The Chantry was born in Orlais. Duncan met her eyes, standing his ground calmly. He lifted his chin. But the gods were born in Ferelden. He raised his voice. Earthamil. I think we have heard. The Archon started to stand, only to nearly fall back into his chair. The crowd gasped. Through the windows, they could see the clouds had begun swirling, making the light flicker. A moment later, a massive dragon emerged from the clouds, wings glimmering golden in the rays of sunlight. It circled the courtyard and descended, eliciting various screams. And a heartbeat before the dragon would have landed on the balcony, it shifted into a tall, handsome man in elegant robes. Green light swirled around him and seemed to trail from his eyes as Earthamil stood before King Duncan. Your Highness. He gave a small bow. You called. The chamber fell utterly silent. She swallowed as she looked at the faces around them, realized what it was they were seeing. Evening knowing as much as she did, it was hard to believe. For centuries, the world had cried out to the gods, and all prayers had gone unanswered. Temples and shrines, obeisance, and sacrifice, and no answer had come. The king of Ferelden, this upstart boy, child of a bastard king of a barbaric land, had called. And a god had answered. Chapter 5, Family. Any aid we can give? The Archon was nodding, occasionally staring at where Earthamil stood next to Duncan. Magister Pavis can oversee the exchanges with the full backing of the Magisterium. He gave Kieran an apologetic, almost frightened look. Unfortunately, with the Qunari pressing on our borders. He sighed, then nodded to Duncan. But with Ferelden in a similar position, I am sure you understand. Selene straightened. We understand that with the Qunari at your borders, these are trying times. We are certain arrangements can be made for Orlais too. Do you truly think the Qunari will remain a concern? Earthamul's voice lazily interrupted her. He turned to glance at Duncan. I thought Orlais had a university. Then he glanced back at Selene. Archon, would you be so kind as to educate the Empress on the fate of Barinder? We are aware of Barinder. The Empress narrowed her eyes. He managed to keep his face composed, but watching Earthamul toy with the player of the great game was fun. The look on her face when Earthamul had emerged from waiting had made playing the bait almost enjoyable. And the composition of Par Valen. Earthamul raised an eyebrow. She started to open her mouth, then hesitated. The Archon spoke instead. I believe he is pointing out that Par Valen is volcanic, Empress. The man was starting to smile. It is not the nature of Par Valen we are questioning. Selene drew herself up. Ah. Earthamul smiled. You doubt I am who I claim. Abominations have made bold claims before. Selene shook her head. So, they have. He inclined his head. Allow me to demonstrate. He gestured, extending his hand toward the window. In the distance they could make out where ground had been cleared for the new wing of the university. The ground there shook, and suddenly a building was rising. The leaders of Thedas watched, slack-jawed, as the Muse crafted a crystal tower with wool alone. Within a matter of minutes, the structure was completed. And it was breathtaking. Earthamul lowered his hand. A gift, Empress, in gratitude for Orlais's long appreciation for art and music. I look forward to seeing the wonders that your people will create in the days to come. Her jaw worked for a moment, and then she took a deep breath before glancing at where Divine Victoria stood. There is still the matter of the chantry. The Maker told Andraste that his second children could one day earn his forgiveness. Earthamul inclined his head. Do you think he would deny the same mercy to his first? Divine Victoria nodded. His first wish? To see the wonders his children would create. With souls made of dream and idea, hope and fear. Earthamul smiled. Endless possibilities. King Duncan. Selene turned toward him. And she smiled. We are looking forward to seeing what a united Thedas can accomplish. As am I, Empress Selene. He inclined his head. Earthamul's. Ruya let out a small laugh. Little performance seems to have shaken things a bit. Part of her wondered just how much of Duncan's performance at the summit had been an act. Divine Victoria shook her head. The Warden always did have a knack for the game, when he bothered to play. And Alistair and Cathiel ruled Ferelden better than any could have hoped. Underestimating their children would be a mistake. She looked up at the statue of Andraste that graced the room. Then she actually giggled. Did you see the looks on their faces? Ruya nodded. Though I imagine my own was fairly similar. What Earthamul said, about the firstborn earning the Maker's forgiveness. But it is perfect, no. Divine Victoria spread her hands. Earthamul could have threatened Orlais the same way he did the heretical Qunari, but instead, he built a wonder, following the Maker's first command to his children. Not all will listen, but that would never have happened anyway. I believe we can sway enough. I think. Josephine gave a small shake of her head. That perhaps they did not tell us everything. I think the fact they didn't tell us everything is something of a given. Brujhan walked in, shaking his head. They allied with the Sentinel, and within an hour of being reunited with that Sentinel, King Duncan has handed him an Arl's estate, right to draw funds from Ferelden's coffers, and practically unlimited authority over Ferelden's first university. Apparently, the Sentinel made an impression. Divine Victoria started to nod, and then her eyes narrowed as they met Brujhan's. What have you learned? The Sentinel, Tissalan. Brujhan folded his arms, and his eyes darkened. He's Salas's brother. Excuse me. Ruya stood. I need to go have a talk with my son. And how do you know Tissalan isn't aiding Salas? His mother was glaring at him, with the Divine backing her up. And the spymaster had a fairly impressive glare of his own, come to think of it. Because if Tissalin were aiding Salas, Salas would have an orb. Tissalin knew where the staff was from the beginning. In hindsight, they really should have questioned just how Tissalin had known so much about the staff. Gavarin shrugged. I suspect he may have been the one to put it there in the first place. Gavarin Dorian Rutherford. And she was now in full Inquisitor mode. He winced. Mother, in that version of the past, Tissalin helped Agatha blow Salas up. He's loyal to Kirin. Do you know why? Brujn raised an eyebrow. Because Earthamil was the muse, and Tissalin was Silonvayan. Gavarin sighed. Tissalin. It was hard to explain. Earthamil had linked them together. He'd felt them, in his mind and soul. Trusting Tissalin was instinctual, the way he trusted that the sun would rise. He's Salas's brother. Brujn folded his arms. Well, if it's family connections that are the issue. Gavarin chuckled as he met Brujn's eyes. He's also your great-great-great and then some grandfather. The look on Brujn's face was almost as good as it had been the first time. Leandra was going to be annoyed she'd missed it. He squared his shoulders as he turned to face his mother again. Mother, in that time, 3 of the Sentinels died protecting us. Nomin. Melavan. A lie. Tissalin killed several of Salas's agents to protect us and fought at our side against Salas. Tissalin could have joined Salas at any time in the last few years. He didn't. What? Josephine glanced at Brujn, who was staring at Gavarin. He's Brujn's. Despite himself, Gavarin chuckled. And you should have seen the look on his face when Kirin told him that the first time around. So yeah, Brujn, guess what? He grinned widely. The Dread Wolf is your uncle. Brujn sighed and rubbed his forehead. So, this is what going mad feels like. Leandra smiled broadly, and then hesitated. Tissalin. I am. Leandra Hawk. Tissalin nodded. I was told you were coming. She stared at him for a moment, then sighed. For just a bit there, I hoped you'd somehow remembered me. She shook her head, then gestured at the 2 young men behind her. I brought some prospective students. She pointed first to the human man. This is my little brother, Varric, but everyone calls him Junior. She turned to point to the elven man. And this is my cousin, Neris. She turned back to Tissalin. They are both mages. Welcome. Tissalin inclined his head in greeting. You're really. Varric blinked. I mean, I should have believed it, but I didn't really believe it and you'd think I'd believe it, but I didn't dash. Varric. Neris sighed. Shutting up. Varric nodded. Tissalin didn't bat an eye. Welcome. I fear there is still work to be done on the accommodations. We are still sorting donations. He glanced over his shoulder. They are surprisingly numerous. Ferelden's first university. Leandra grinned. Led by a professor who hails from no less than Arlathan itself. She spread her hands. We brought you even more stuff. She reached into her pack and pulled out a piece of parchment. Uncle Caleb catalogued it all for you. That is. Tissalin actually smiled. More appreciated than perhaps you imagine. Colin looked up when his second-in-command entered. The man looked a bit shaken. Kells. Sir, I humbly request that I never again be asked to ride a dragon. Kells took a deep breath. I will try, but times being what they are. He smiled. Report. The Warden's people have been recovering ancient weapons since. He shrugged. Apparently since before the Inquisition was even founded. It seems when Danya, Talsaad, and Temarin aren't here, they are working on restoring them. He shrugged a satchel off his shoulder and set it down. Schematics for the ones that can be recreated are in there. There is also a list of ones that have been repaired but cannot be recreated that will be given over to the Inquisition to be used as needed. Those that are not mobile can be used to create strongholds and fallback points, and a map has also been provided. He took a deep breath. As for the Warden's forces, you've confirmed what we've suspected. Cullen raised an eyebrow. The Darkspawn simply fell back to lay in reserve. And there are far more of them than we thought. There are also a considerable number that have been freed, similar to the messenger. They can command the other kind and serve as generals. Kells swallowed. There is still the risk of blight contamination from their presence, and the warden pointed out that while he can mitigate that damage, it is likely in the days ahead he is going to have greater concerns, and thus it is best to practice caution and let the Grey Wardens handle Darkspawn-related activities. I imagine the Order is not going to be pleased at finding their ancient enemies are their newest allies. General. Kells sighed. Cullen, based on what we know of Solas and what he's capable of, then. He took a deep breath. Even with everything, there is a good chance we won't win this. If that's true, then. He squared his shoulders. Then I intend to go out fighting. You. At your command, Ser. Kells saluted. After a second demonstration, the young human woman took a deep breath. She repeated the form. It was a little wobbly and uncertain, but correct. Tissalan nodded and saw her face break into a wide smile. Her next attempt was more confident. He watched a moment longer, then nodded to her again before walking to observe the next group. Another human came up to join him. It was strange, coming out of his self-imposed solitude, to find himself not only surrounded by humans, but teaching them. "How are your students coming?" Duncan asked. The Muse had told him he could trust the Human King, yet the young man had still taken him by surprise. He'd expected to be a bodyguard or assassin. Instead, there is potential. Tissalan gave the practice yard a critical look. Not all the students had the makings of warriors, yet after so many years he found it difficult to turn any students away. He'd expected to hear an objection from the king when he'd begun recruiting other teachers, but it seemed Duncan had been in earnest when he'd promised Tissalan could teach who and what he wanted. He'd even given them their own printing press. Neris and Melina could become full Dirthiana and Azalan. Not Varric. He raised an eyebrow and glanced at where the human and his elven companions were working a sword drill. At first glance, the human appeared to be as skilled as the other two. It is not his humanity, if that is your concern. Tissalan shook his head. The young man's magic would have been impressive even for an elf. He'd been surprised to learn Varric's mother was a blood mage. Such was heavily disapproved of in this time, and not without reason. His magic is more suited to other paths. Neris, however. Tissalan shrugged. Were we in Arlathan, I would guide him towards the amber path. The one you walked. Duncan nodded. Tissalan raised an eyebrow, then returned the nod. I forget sometimes that while you are all but a stranger to me, I am known to you. That had been one of the most disconcerting things. Duncan had treated him as an old friend almost from their first meeting and seemed to trust him completely. Those who had objected to the existence of either himself or the academy had found themselves risking the wrath of the king. I wouldn't go so far as to say known, but you fought at our side. He smiled. By the end of it, most of us were calling you Grandpa. You even trained us a bit. He shrugged. Well, mostly Jarath, the rest of us had a hard time keeping up. Your general? Tissalan nodded. He'd met the man only briefly, but General Jarath had also greeted him as an old friend. He'd even given Tissalan the proper elven greeting between teacher and student. He could also walk the amber path. Yeah, I don't pay him enough. Duncan frowned. Doesn't this amber path require magic? It requires will. Before, they were one and the same. He looked over his students again. A small group was beneath a tree, books in their laps, arguing animatedly about some point held within. Another group was using magic to carefully balance river stones. Humans, elves, even a couple dwarves and beings that called themselves Qunari. Tissalan smiled. Now, however, is a different world. He looked over the 24 guards that had been sent from Kirkwall. Griffin riders. Jarath nodded to their leader, a sturdy young woman whose only mark of rank was a knotted badge on one shoulder. Lieutenant Hender. She immediately saluted. General Gilmore. Jarath gestured. We've made space for your griffins on the western bluffs. Ours are stationed to the east. Goal is to keep territorial disputes to a minimum until they get used to each other. He glanced at one of the griffins and nodded. Black Wings. Out of Tamlin. Yes, sir. Annabel Hender nodded. Commander Hawk thought it best to send our strongest distance flyers. Ferelden has a lot of ground to cover. Kirkwall's finest is nothing to scoff at. He gestured for her to follow him. The Viscount says you are as good a swordswoman as your mother. He rotated a shoulder. I sparred with her a few times. I think I've still got a couple bruises from it. He gestured at where Duncan was exiting the hall. Your Majesty, may I present Lieutenant Annabel Hender of Kirkwall? A lieutenant. Duncan blinked. He tossed the parchment he'd been holding onto his desk. I thought Varric said he was sending a captain something or other. Annabel squared her shoulders, lifting her chin a little as she met Duncan's eyes. He was planning on sending Captain Duval, but Guard Captain Avellini recommended me instead. Figures. Duncan gave her a skeptical look. You're her daughter, yes. She narrowed her eyes. Yes. She shook her head. Commander Hawk seconded the recommendation. We don't really have time to babysit a newbie. Duncan frowned. I have been with the Guard for a year now. Annabel glared. A whole year. And a lieutenant already. Duncan folded his arms. And the rest? He continued glaring back at Annabel. Solid griffins, though I admit to not being an expert. Ser Logain is leading Guerin's riders. They should be here tomorrow. He flicked his eyes from one to the other. Well, this was going to be very amusing. Logain. Duncan blinked, turning toward him for the first time. What about Captain Carinal? He has gone to aid the warden. Jarath took a deep breath, his earlier amusement vanishing. The news he'd just received could have many meanings, but none of them were good. I'm told most of the other Dragonsworn have gone as well. Mafaroth's balls. Annabel and Duncan swore simultaneously. Jarath continued. Commander Hawk remains in Kirkwall, Danya with the Inquisition, and Ser Logain is on his way here. Lady Merrill is gone from Kirkwall, though Gavarin indicated she is with Mythil rather than with the Warden. General Cullen believes they are all in active communication with him and remained as part of whatever he is doing now. The others, as far as we know, have all gone. Well, shit. Duncan frowned. He turned his attention back to Annabel. The stakes are high, Lieutenant. You're not going to be coddled here. Her feet were firmly planted, and she glared. I'm not the one that needs a bodyguard every time I set foot out of my bedroom, Your Majesty. She turned and stalked back towards the griffins. She's going to be trouble. Duncan pronounced. He blinked at Jarath. You're smirking. Why are you smirking? Oh, no reason. Jarath shrugged. And on the diplomatic side. If Terna Anara could get out of bed, she'd put me over her knee. The woman had to pick now to get ill? He felt a pang of guilt at the thought, and sighed. Kieran's helping, a lot. Or maybe it's Earthamil. Feels a bit strange having Tevinter as our strongest ally, but all Kieran has to do is glow a little and the Archon is falling all over himself to assist. Varric, Caleb, and the Inquisitor's brother Lucas are rallying the marches. Caleb managed to get Sebastian to stand with us. He smiled. Antava and Riven have Cunary to worry about but will lend aid. Oh, Gavarin has agreed to officially be named my court mage. Him single-handedly driving the Cunary out of our harbor has half of Tevinter snickering. The Inquisition still has some treaties with Navarra. What about the Anderfells? The ambassador will be arriving shortly, along with a representative from Weishaupt. They've requested to meet with you, as you represent Ferelden's military. I'll be ready, Your Majesty. Jarath nodded. And the mages? Yeah. Duncan nodded. I've got a meeting about them tomorrow. The white-haired elven woman gave him a hesitant look as his new guard captain showed her into his office. Duncan inclined his head. Thank you, Clara. That will be all. She nodded and left the room, though he knew she wouldn't go far. Grand Enchanter Fiona gave him a small bow. You asked to speak with me, Your Majesty. Duncan looked her over, then gestured for her to sit. He knew she was an old woman, but she looked friendlier than he'd expected. I did. With what we've learned recently. He nodded. We will need the help of mages. Fiona nodded. Of course. I have not forgotten that Ferelden gave us shelter when no one else would. Your father was a... She swallowed. Good man. He was. Duncan nodded. There was another matter as well. A personal one. He took a deep breath. Your Majesty. She raised an eyebrow. I wanted to. He looked up and met her eyes. For a moment, he felt like a small child again. I wanted to meet my grandmother. She stared at him for several long moments. Then she took a ragged breath. A tear fell from one eye and rolled slowly down her cheek. How did you? It's a long story that. He looked down at his hands. Involves time travel, demons, the fate of the world, and... He shrugged and gave her a tentative smile. Hello. He named you Duncan. Her smile trembled. I wish I could have told him just how perfect a choice that was. I wish. She sighed. Fiona closed her eyes, then brushed a tear from her cheek. I wish so many things. He smiled, then looked up when the door opened. Wynne entered, leading Bryce and Merrick. Fiona's eyes welled up again at the sight of them. Would you like to meet the rest of your grandchildren? He stood, gesturing toward his siblings. Yes. She put her hands over her heart. Oh, yes. Salas. Gavrin blinked. The fade swirled around them. Harin. The cracks have reached the Banal. They have woken. Salas clasped his hands behind his back. The warden holds for now, but at least 2 are loosed in the world. And we do not know which 2 for certain. Elgar'nan and Anaris were both wounded and withdrew, but it could be any of the others. Warn your mother. Wake, Delenn. Chapter 6, Rifts. The King of Ferelden. Dorian looked at the drink in his hand. Has effectively conquered Tevinter. Ruya gave a small shake of her head. Duncan had his father's charm and his mother's keen mind, as well as an old god as an unofficial chancellor. How long will it last? Honestly, I am not certain. Dorian took a drink. Tevinter has suffered coups before, but generally it's a matter of one mage killing another mage and becoming Archon. A situation like this one has simply never before occurred. It will last as long as the current Archon lives, certainly. Iron Bull took the drink from him and refilled it. Thank you, Amatus. And Gavrin's news. Cullen raised an eyebrow. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him. I was under the impression that there were only 7 of these, Iron Bull shrugged. 7 Evan Uris. Brujn nodded. But there are also the so-called Forgotten Ones, those banished in the war. I don't know if it's fortunate or unfortunate, but it seems they are all more pissed off at Salas than they are at each other. Ruya sighed. He does seem to have that effect on people. Dorian leaned back in his chair. What do we know about the ones that escaped? Well, we know that neither of them are Elgar'nan or Anaris, which seem to be the most powerful. Ruya folded his arms. And we also don't know how long the warden can hold. We do know he can't come to our aid, not any longer. Brujn sighed. He's the only thing keeping the rest of them from escaping and pretty much obliterating the world. If we face them in smaller numbers we may have a fighting chance. Divine Victoria nodded. Especially with Earthamiel and Salas. She frowned. What news of Mythal? She's working with Merrill and some others to restore defenses and repair the Veil. Kells shrugged. Since the Warden and Earthamiel have the orbs, Mythal is nowhere near strong enough to do any fighting. I've got a question. Iron Bull folded his arms. If the Warden's busy, who is keeping the Darkspawn off our asses? Nathaniel how? Kells turned toward him. I thought about asking but figured that even if they did explain I probably wouldn't understand a word of it anyway. I know that feeling. Brujn nodded. Any news on the Qunari? They've figured out something has drawn our attention and seem to be in a holding pattern. Ruya sighed. My guess is they figure we'll weaken ourselves and then they can come in and mop up. Sad thing is, That plan might just work. Iron Bull sighed. Where did those come from? Duncan raised an eyebrow at some strangely marked crates piled in the university's courtyard. Mother sent them. He turned to see Kieran. Oh. He shifted awkwardly. So she's okay with all this. Why would she not be? Kieran gave him a confused look. One of those silly kind of worries, I suppose. Duncan chuckled. I am pleased by this. Kieran turned to look at where Tassalin was supervising some of the students as they sorted books. He is happier with students. Earthamiel made it clear that he and Tassalin had known each other, but neither of you ever really gave details. At least, none that I understood. Duncan shrugged. The green light came into Kieran's eyes. The Solanavan were mine. Yours. Duncan raised an eyebrow. They were artists. I was inspiration. The muse. They were owned by the Evan-Uris, but they belonged to me. Earthamiel's voice sounded sad. And I to them. The songs we made. He turned his gaze to Duncan. Thank you, Delenn. The manor isn't going to be enough room. Duncan nodded. I'm going to give them that fort in Crestwood. It's well located, fortified, defensible, and there's a pretty big lake in case of Desh flames exploded from somewhere in the back of the grounds. That, Duncan finished. Wise. Earthamiel nodded. He shrugged as something else exploded, then turned back to Duncan. I will go to Crestwood and set wards. Thank you. The Black Divine looks familiar for some reason. Duncan frowned. He glanced at Agatha. Have I met him before? Not to my knowledge. Agatha shook her head. Possibly in passing. He was one of the Lucerni prior to becoming the Black Divine. And back when he was simply Magister Adralicus, he dash. Adralicus. Duncan dropped the papers he'd just picked up and stared at his spymaster. That's Adralicus. Gavarin shook his head. Next to him, Leandra ran a hand down her face. Gerotha's eyes were closed, and he looked slightly pained. The name means something to you. Agatha raised an eyebrow. They exchanged a look. Duncan sighed and rubbed his forehead. We may owe him an apology. He took a deep breath, then turned to Geroth. How did the meeting with the Anderfell's ambassador go? They're not happy, but they're in. He shrugged. The meeting was a formality. The warden's stunt with Weishaupt a few years back ensured that as long as you've got his backing, they're going to do whatever you ask. What I ask? Duncan raised an eyebrow. Agatha stared at him, then started chuckling. Oh, for the love of... She shook her head. Sometimes, oh second favorite king, you really are daft. Agatha. He glared at her. This uniting the world thing you're doing, the alliance you're building. She laughed. You still haven't figured out you're the one leading it. He stared at her for a moment, then sat down heavily in his chair. His friends were giving him sympathetic looks. Well. He let out his breath. Shit. Wynne smiled as she watched Bryce showing off his magic to their newly acquired grandmother. All things considered, she wasn't exactly sure how she felt about the situation, but Bryce seemed thrilled. She glanced over her shoulder. Aunt Lenore. I seem to have lost an apprentice. Lenore chuckled. What's the word from Kal Hyrule? She shrugged. Same as usual. Some days I can't figure out why Kal Hyrule and Ferelden bother with the pretext they are separate countries. She sighed. It's the settlement that has me worried. News that elven gods were on the loose was stirring up old resentments in the elven settlement. On both sides. Yeah, same here. I'll be headed back to Gweren in the morning to see what I can do there. She swallowed. Anora had forged the alliances between Gweren and the settlement. Her presence would have settled much of the rumbling. Anora. Lenore's voice was gentle. Pella is doing what she can, but... Wynne sighed, and gave a small shake of her head. All we can do now is make her comfortable. Loghain is spending as much time with her as possible, but given. She folded her arms, then reached up to wipe at her eyes. Ferelden is losing one of its strongest voices when we need her the most. Lenore put her arm around Wyn, and Wyn rested her head on Lenore's shoulder. There was a time I wouldn't have been able to imagine saying this, but... She kissed the top of Wyn's head. I am going to miss her. Leandra started toward Duncan's office, and the guard on duty lifted a hand to stop her. Something wrong. She blinked. He's arguing with the Griffin rider from Kirkwall. General Gilmore asked that they not be disturbed. The guard looked slightly familiar, with pale skin and dark hair. General Gilmore is arguing with Annabel. She blinked. She'd have thought those two would get along just fine. Both were soldiers to their very core. No. The king is. The guard shrugged. You're Leandra Hawke, right? Yep. She shrugged. And you are? Lieutenant Clara Howe. Clara smiled. They say your father once pulled the horns of a Cunnery and stabbed it to death with them. Yeah. She nodded. That sounds like my father. She tilted her head. How? Yes. Clara's expression became a little defensive. Those House. I met your Uncle Nathaniel a few times. You're not going to get any shit from me. Leandra gave her a reassuring smile. I'm just surprised to find you guarding this particular hallway. I'd have thought the guard captain would, well. I am the captain of the King's Guard. Clara drew herself up proudly. The general himself picked me for after the tourney. Wait. Leandra's smile broadened. You're the one that knocked the Empress's champion out cold. She laughed. We heard about that all the way in Kirkwall. Father could hardly tell the story without laughing. She glanced at the door. So what exactly are they arguing about? Something about a requisition, but mostly they just really don't seem to like each other. Honestly, I think the only reason she's in there right now is the king annoyed the general or something and the general is messing with him a little. She's got a double watch on the east approach. Duncan shook his head. What's she worried about coming up from Denerim? Children mostly. Jarath glanced down at his report, his face slightly turned away from Duncan. Sneaking up to take a look at the griffins. Oh. Duncan frowned. The Kirkwall Griffin captain was just one of many irritations he had to deal with. And she's rude. You don't pay either of us enough to be having this conversation. Agatha shook her head. She's doing fine. Jarath rolled his eyes before tossing the report onto the table. Several of its pages slid off, scattering across the floor. And even if she wasn't, she'd be my problem, not yours. You're cranky today. Duncan blinked. He turned to face his friend. What's wrong? The Grand Cleric has increased her guard. Agatha bent to pick up a couple of the pages. Jarath gave a twitch of his shoulder before sighing and going to pick up the rest. That doesn't make any sense. Duncan frowned. The chantry was well inside the city, and away from the harbor. We already increased the guard on the outer wall. That's why. Jarath leaned on the table. She seems to think our guards are a threat. That's ridiculous. Duncan shook his head. And frankly, it was also a little insulting. Her concern is our alliance with Earthamule. Agatha sighed. He opened his mouth, and then shook his head again. But Divine Victoria is also questionable to the Grand Cleric. Jarath threw the report down on the table. Salah is concerned we are being led away from the true chantry, and thus are not in the grace of the Maker. She thinks Gavrin is a heretic, and that the chantry should not allow him to run around loose. She thinks the Warden is a demon masquerading as one of Ferelden's heroes in an attempt to sway you from the path of light. She still thinks our entire story is a fade dream. And let's not even get started on her opinion of Earthamule. Well. Duncan folded his arms. Gavrin is not her concern and he has safe passage on Ferelden soil. He lifted his chin. Regardless of the Grand Cleric's wishes, he was still king here. She would do well to remember that. The Academy is also a concern for the Grand Cleric. Agatha held up another piece of parchment. She thinks Tessalin is a demon worshipper. Or a demented liar. Or both. Tessalin doesn't worship anyone. Duncan growled. They'd had only minor trouble thus far and moving the Academy out to Crestwood had solved most of the problems. Or at least, made it so the problems couldn't actually interfere. I will treat the Grand Cleric with the respect her station deserves, but she's to let the Academy alone. Divine Victoria agrees. He frowned. Any other concerns? Before either of his people could answer, another voice spoke. If I may. He turned towards the sound, and then his eyes widened. Fenharel. Salas stepped out of the shadows. Your Highness. He gave a respectful nod. There are refugees in need of shelter. Salas hesitated a moment, then met Duncan's eyes. Many of them are children. You're concerned they'll go after your followers. Duncan glanced back at his spymaster and general, and then nodded. Elven children, which is why you don't want them in Orlais. Yes. Tissalin's academy about to be moved to Crestwood, and both we and the Inquisition have soldiers nearby. That may be the best place for them. Duncan nodded. Thank you, Your Highness. Salas nodded. Will you permit an Elevian? I will leave that negotiation to Tissalin, he knows more of them, and of you, than I do. We will extend Ferelden's hospitality, Fenharel. He drew himself up and narrowed his eyes. But we expect that hospitality to be respected in turn. I understand. Salas gave a small bow before vanishing once more into the shadows. Agatha exhaled. Duncan. Yes. He turned toward her. You realize you just threatened a god? Yep. He shrugged. Anything else to report? Neris imitated his movements smoothly, and Melina was only a half-heartbeat behind. Junior. Tissalin smiled at the young man, and saw Junior give him an abashed smile as both Neris and Melina turned to help him back to his feet. They make it look so easy. Junior grinned at his friends. They make the same complaint of you, whenever I demonstrate a new spell. He inclined his head toward the young man. The three were the most advanced of his students, though in all fairness, they had a head start. All three had received training at the hands of those that called themselves Dragonsworn. He took some small pleasure in the fact they cooperated and inspired each other, keeping their competitions light and friendly. It had not always been that way, in Arlathan. I think we. He trailed off when he saw the figure on the other side of the room. All three of his students must have caught his expression, as they went immediately on alert. Harin. Melina raised an eyebrow at him. The truest way to show you understand something is to teach it to another. He flicked his eyes toward Junior. Teach your companion. He waited until they had nodded before walking over to where the other man stood. His eyes narrowed slightly. Salas. Tissalin. Salas watched as Neris and Melina both began guiding Junior through the motions. Your students are dash. Why are you here? He clasped his hands behind his back. Salas sighed. I just spoke with King Duncan. There are children who may be in danger. He suggested I bring them here. Students are always welcome. He turned to look at Junior, who was laughing, but performing the form correctly. Then he turned back to Salas. Regardless of origin. I understand. Salas inclined his head. I would also like to place an Elevian dash. There is one here already. Tissalin twitched a shoulder. Earthamule placed it when we moved the university to this fortress. I would like one of mine to dash. No. Two pairs of grey eyes met. The Dread Wolf looked away first. Very well. The first of the students will arrive in the morning. I will ensure accommodations are prepared for them. He turned and walked back toward his students. Junior was just finishing an awkward yet correct rendition of the form. Well done, all of you. Three faces beamed back at him. The herald allowed Andraste's blessing to be stolen by the Dread Wolf. The Grand Cleric paced the room. Now this. She took a deep breath. Travesty. They are good men led astray, Grand Cleric. Salah sighed. I know, Mother Salah. The Grand Cleric nodded gravely. But I fear times are growing desperate. The king must see the error of his ways before it is too late. She put her hands on Salah's shoulders. I must ask you to do something unpleasant, my child, but I fear it necessary. The very soul of Ferelden's king is at stake. Thank you for coming. Salah smiled. You're my sister, Salah. Jarath nodded to her. It was too much to hope she'd understand, but he hated being at odds with her. If for no reason other than it made their mother unhappy when she couldn't have both her children at her table. We aren't trying to be enemies. Of you, or of the Chantry. I know. She poured wine into 2 goblets. You're good men and I just. She sighed. I know how far you'll go for a friend, and that worries me. She took a deep breath. But I must acknowledge that it's as likely you'll bring them to the right path as they'll lead you astray. She handed him one of the goblets. Jarath took it and shook his head at her. It's also possible that what you see as the wrong path isn't. Is it really so hard to believe we are telling the truth? Yes. Salah drank from the goblet, then stared down at the contents. It shouldn't be. You're my brother and to the best of my knowledge, you've never lied to me. But just because you believe something doesn't make it true. She frowned, then looked back at him. So, tell me the truth. Is Ser Logain Mactir an abomination? What happens if I say yes? He drank from his goblet. The world changed, whether the Chantry approved or not. Jarath. She folded one arm over her chest. That alone should be evidence enough that you are being led astray. But there are ways to help your friend. Like what happened with Connor in Redcliffe. He took another drink. He's not that kind of abomination. Do you even hear yourself? She sighed and drained her goblet before setting it on the edge of the table. Yes. Do you? He copied her gesture. Salah, you've known us our entire lives. You should know we wouldn't make something like this up. The threat is real. It is. She walked behind her desk. He started walking towards her desk and stumbled as a wave of dizziness came over him. He caught the edge of the desk to keep himself from falling. The edges of his vision started to gray, and he looked up at his sister. And her face was sad, but otherwise calm. Salah. He felt the pang of realization. Salah, what did you do? I'm trying to protect you. She stared at him. And Ferelden. Don't worry, they won't hurt him. The king. You. He tried to turn, and darkness claimed him. Chapter 7, A Grand Cleric. Duncan frowned when he saw the 2 women in front of his desk. His eyes went first to Clara. Where is General Gilmore? She blinked. He was called away by his sister. He left me the watch. She frowned. Is something wrong? I ordered him not to let her in. He pointed at the second woman. Annabel Hender folded her arms. If you'd respond to my messages, I wouldn't have to come here. Your requests were ignored for a reason. She sent him at least 4 pieces of parchment every day, all of which ended up on his desk despite his orders to the contrary. We already stand double watches. It's not for defense, it's for training, which you'd know if you actually bothered to read the requests. She glared as she took a step forward. He took a step towards her. Your people should already be Duncan cut off at the sound of the door opening again. 6 armed men entered, dressed in Templar-style armor. Both Clara and Annabel immediately shifted to put themselves between him and the newcomers. State your purpose. Clara put a hand on her sword hilt. Annabel matched her stance. We come in the name of Andraste. The man in the lead stared at Duncan. Per orders of the Grand Cleric, the king is to be taken into custody. Both Annabel and Clara drew their weapons. This is Ferelden, and the Grand Cleric has no such authority. Duncan shook his head and found himself wishing his bow were within reach. He'd never expected to need it in his own office. She has the authority of the Maker. The lead man looked from Clara to Annabel. Stand down, and you will not be harmed. Walk away. Clara set her feet. And you'll live to see another dawn. The lead man gestured, and the Templars came forward. Duncan dove for his bow as Annabel and Clara blocked the first attacks. He came up and saw more entering. As good as the 2 women were, sheer numbers would overwhelm them. He fired an arrow, and the lead Templar batted it aside with his shield. Then Duncan hit the release for the secret passage. Clara, Annabel, move. They followed him into the passage. Clara hit the release that closed the portcullis, blocking the Templars' advance. Annabel blinked. The Viscount needs one of these. Tell him to talk to Teresa Elick. Duncan started moving. Mafarotha's balls. Duncan looked through the peephole. They knew enough to guess at the exits. We'll never make the West Tower. Then go east. Clara turned to Annabel. Get him onto one of your griffins. Hang on a minute. Duncan started to shake his head. Clara ignored him. And take him to Vigil's Keep. He'll be safe, and we've got forces there. Plus, the Inquisition has a presence, and I'm reasonably sure there is an Elevian. Right. Annabel nodded. Let's go, Your Majesty. He started to object again, then shook his head. Arguing would be foolish, considering Clara was right. Jarath relied on the woman with good reason. He met Clara's eyes. Get to Jarath. He'll know what to do here. I know. Clara swallowed. Which is why he isn't here. Duncan nodded in realization. He went to see his sister at the fucking chantry. He growled. Get to Keelan and Agatha. I'll get the Silver Order moving. Clara nodded before heading down one of the passages. He turned to Annabel. I'm in your hands, Lieutenant. Let's move. She nodded, her eyes fierce. His head hurt. Jarath swallowed, and awareness flooded back into him. He tried to stand, only to discover he'd been bound to a wooden column. He was kneeling, with his ankles also bound. His weapons and armor had been removed. Salah stepped into his line of sight and started to offer him a cup. He jerked his head away, wincing as he did. She sighed. It's just water. When his only response was a glare, she took a drink from the cup and offered it again. It will ease the headache. I am sorry, Jarath. You've betrayed your king. He stared. He wasn't sure what galled him more. That she'd done it, or that he hadn't seen it coming. And your brother? I'm trying to save you. Both of you. She sighed. There was no way you'd have allowed the king to be taken into custody. This way, we can resolve the matter peacefully. Guide him back into the Maker's grace. She narrowed her eyes and offered the glass again. Don't be stubborn. With a sigh, he let her give him the water. It cleared the dregs of whatever she'd dosed him with earlier. How long was I out? Always the tactician. She smiled, then tousled his hair as though he were a small child. You're so much like father. Salah set the empty glass on the table. We won't hold you long. Like you said, Ferelden's military reports to you, and they'll need you to help keep things stable. I hope you'll see reason. You have to. The Grand Cleric put you up to this. He tested his bonds. The rope around his wrists wasn't tight enough to cut off circulation, but there was no slack to it. And he'd likely been kneeling long enough that he'd have trouble rising. A quick rush to escape wasn't going to be an option. His fingers began working toward his sleeve. And then his sister held up his holdout dagger. Looking for this. She chuckled. You're my brother, Jarath. I've known you all your life. I searched you for weapons 3 times before having you secured, and twice after. She shrugged. When did you start carrying a dagger in your backplate? Around the time the third crow stopped in. He gave her an annoyed look. You're committing treason, Salah. I'm helping save our king from himself. She raised her chin defiantly. How did the Grand Cleric even talk you into this? Jarath pulled at the bonds on his wrists. Salah, you know us. This is exactly the wrong way to get us to cooperate with anything. That's where you're wrong. Salah sighed. The best way to get either of you to cooperate was always to focus on the other. We won't hurt you, Jarath. But you'll remain in custody until the king is safely under our protection. The black-winged griffin landed on the tower of Vigil's Keep. A gray-haired dwarven woman met him there, already in full armor. He bowed. Warden Commander. Your Majesty. Senator returned the bow, then dropped the formality. What happened? The Grand Cleric attempted to take me into custody. I believe she is holding General Gilmore prisoner. They've already engaged in violence, but their forces aren't sufficient to hold the castle, let alone the city. Then they failed the moment you escaped. Setida frowned, and then shook her head. No, the Grand Cleric is smarter than that. And she has my general. He didn't have to add that she also had his best friend. Setida knew him well enough to know. The twins are at the academy in Crestwood and Wynne is in Guerin, but there are other hostages available to her. He made a frustrated noise. She wants Gaverin arrested and thinks the warden is a demon. Stone save us all from fanatics. Setida sighed. He could almost see the wheels in her mind start turning. She and Anara had taught him most of what he knew about politics. She'd know you'd come here. Bringing the wardens or the orders in would be the wrong move. It would play right into her hands. The warden founded the orders, she could spin the story to her purposes. Shit. Duncan nodded. Bringing in our forces from the academy would have similar results. He squared his shoulders. There was another option available to him. I need to get word to Highever. He sighed. And warn Gaverin before he walks into the center of a mess. Gaverin and Leandra stood by the fireplace. Duncan stood in front of his uncle. Annabel stood a pace behind him, at his right shoulder. The woman had refused to leave his side until dismissed from that responsibility, and to his irritation also refused to allow him to be the one to dismiss it. Ternkaus Land was staring back at him. You are my king and my nephew, and of course my forces are at your disposal, but you must admit some of her points are valid. He sighed. Valid. Duncan shook his head. You've made an alliance with the archdemon that very nearly destroyed Ferelden. Ternkaus Land folded his arms. There are many still who remember the days of the Blight. You and I know the truth, Duncan. But the rest of the world is still questioning. It is a delicate situation, and things can still fall out either way. I know. Duncan rubbed the back of his neck. Something about the entire situation just wasn't sitting right. And something about it almost seemed to smell familiar. Discredit the divine and she improves her chances of becoming divine. Gaverin shook his head. And so, history repeats. And my spymaster was arrested. Duncan waved a hand. She escaped a few minutes later, but apparently she was accused of being an agent of Fenharel. He didn't miss the twinkle of amusement in Leandra's eyes at that statement. Which limits her options. Clara is holding the guard together, but we don't know Jarotha's status. He is alive. They all turned at the sound of Kieran's voice. Duncan couldn't help but feel just a trace of relief at his presence. Fergus paled slightly. How long have you been there? Long enough. He nodded to Fergus. I do not blame you for questioning me, Ternkaus Land. I would be surprised if you did not. I assure you, I am here to do what I can to help. You and I going in would be a momentously bad idea. Gaverin said, nodding to Kieran. Duncan will be all kinds of annoyed if we break his favorite city. Bait. Duncan kicked the desk and swore. Excuse me. Gaverin blinked. Duncan turned towards them. The Grand Cleric was always a pain in the ass, but a coup? She'd try to talk me to death, but armed men. She didn't go for a blade until after the banal then opened. This is a trap. He looked from Kieran to Gaverin, and back again. For the two of you. Bloody hell, he's right. Leandra stood. Whether they caught him or he did get out was irrelevant. You two would immediately get involved. Duncan, if you're wrong. Gaverin took a deep breath. It's Jarotha's life at stake. I know. He hung his head. I know. He sighed. I'm not saying we don't go in. I'm just saying we need to be aware it's a trick. Well, then. Kieran nodded. I suggest we call in an expert. This is ridiculous, Salah. Jaroth shook his head. He tugged at the ropes binding his wrists. Do you intend to keep me tied up for the rest of my life? Of course, not, I. Salah straightened as the door opened. Grand Cleric. The woman entered and gave Salah a courteous nod. Salah virtually curtsied in response. Mother Salah, may I have a word with your brother in private? Of course. Salif grabbed her embroidery and quickly left the room. Jarath looked up at the Grand Cleric before turning his gaze to the two men that had accompanied her. Oddly, one was an elven man, tall and broadly built for an elf. The other wore Templar armor and a badge that marked him as a knight captain. Both men wore swords and carried themselves like men familiar with the weapons. And every instinct he had was telling him the elf was the more dangerous of the two, despite the other man's rank. The king escaped you. A small matter. The Grand Cleric shrugged. He fled to Vigil's keep, exactly as expected, to seek his demons. She looked down at him. But he will hesitate to make a decisive strike while I hold the life of his oldest friend. She shrugged. And once you publicly denounce the demons, it will take little effort to bring him to heel. He let out an annoyed sigh. You have no means of gaining my cooperation. She laughed and took a step towards him. Her fingertip traced the scars on his cheek. On the contrary, I have your sister and your mother. I am certain you would prefer to avoid harm coming to either. A slow chill went through him, and then a dawning realization. His gaze went to the elven man. And which one are you? The man laughed. Not bad, Shem. He shrugged. I am called Geldoron. Not that I expect you to recognize the name. One of the Forgotten Ones. Jarath nodded. And your sister is? He looked back at the woman in front of him. The guise of the Grand Cleric fell away, revealing a breathtakingly beautiful elven woman. Sivera. She gave a low laugh. The warden and his ilk have a curious fondness for Ferelden. She reached down and caught his chin, turning his head to one side so she could better see the scars. And you are his namesake. She touched the scars again. Odd that Earthamiel would permit such a flaw in one of his devotees. She released him. Attempt to escape, and it will be your family that pays the price. Her eyes glowed briefly, and then the Grand Cleric was standing there once more. We still need a way into the city. His uncle Fergus looked down at the map. The Kaus landmen were with him, and Hyaver's forces nearly matched Denerim's. The problem was he didn't want any of his people hurt, least of all for them to be hurt fighting each other. If they see us coming, the hostages may suffer. We've got a way in. Duncan pointed at the map. He'd learned of those passages as a small child and had run them often, back in more innocent days. These days, he pretended he didn't know of their existence. Allowing some light smuggling was a fair price to pay for the information Agatha regularly received from the smugglers. There are passages through the alienage. Banshee Ani can get us in. And how do we get to her? Fergus raised an eyebrow. Duncan turned towards Kieran, who nodded. There is an Eluvian. We can get to the alienage through that. He blinked. There is an Eluvian in Denerim. One of Aunt Meryl's. Kieran nodded. I can activate it and link it to the one here. It was Fergus's turn to blink. There is an Eluvian in Hyever. Of course. Fergus went pale again when Salas answered. The elven man stepped out of the shadows. Flemeth was once the lady here, after all. From the look on Fergus's face, he clearly hadn't realized that before. Kieran tapped the map. We will emerge here. Jarath is in the chantry. Flemeth was. Fergus exhaled. All right. We can. Kieran's eyes abruptly started to glow, and his voice deepened. No. Duncan blinked. No. Earthamiel narrowed glowing eyes as he tilted his head to one side. Jarath reports that Sivera and Geldoron are behind this. Fenharil and I will have to accompany you. You will not stand a chance against them otherwise. They will have prepared for Eluvians. Salas frowned. How did? Fergus blinked. That was a good question, come to think of it. He is one of mine. Earthamiel straightened. I was listening. Questions about that could wait. Let the Eluvian serve as a distraction. Duncan squared his shoulders. Uncle Fergus, have your forces supplement the elves. Get me to here. He tapped a different location on the map. Time to call in a different set of allies. And we'll see what the Jennies can do. Corin stared. Earthamiel, Fenharil, and the King of Ferelden walk into my bar. He shook his head. He set down the pitcher of beer he'd been about to pour and gestured to the half-dozen men also in the bar. They all began gathering weapons and armor. There better be a damn good punchline coming. He held out a hand to Duncan. Hey cousin. I heard someone is trying to steal your castle. Duncan nodded as he accepted the handshake. Though they both knew that Corrin's mother, Goldanna, was not in fact Alistair's sister, they'd been family for too long to let that change. Especially not when the relationship was so advantageous to them both. Plus, Corrin's eldest brother had married one of Fergus's daughters, meaning they technically were family anyway. Agatha already made contact with you. Yep. Corrin shrugged, and his eyes hardened. Smuggler, crook, con man, and spy though he was also Ferelden, as were the rest of his men. We've got you away into the palace. You never saw it before and you'll never see it again. Ah. Duncan checked his quiver. One of those. Salas turned towards Gavrin. Sivera is no frontline fighter, and her offensive magic is weak. You may have to keep her distracted, however, so that she cannot aid Geldoron. Once Earthamil and I neutralize him, dealing with her should be simple enough. She is, however, a shapeshifter, one capable of duplicating faces. I recommend no one go anywhere alone. Why not just kill Geldoron? Duncan asked. That is not as easy as it sounds, Delenn. Salas nodded towards Kieran. I've killed him 4 times now. Yes. Kieran nodded. Father has been meaning to have a talk with you about that. Which is why I ordinarily take great pains to avoid your father knowing where I am. Salas shook his head. We should hurry. They aren't who you think they are. Jarath gritted his teeth in frustration. For once in her life, he wished Salah would just listen. Do you hear how ridiculous you sound? Salah paced in front of him, shaking her head. Salah. He sighed. There was no way he was going to convince her that the Grand Cleric was secretly an elven goddess in disguise. Even though he knew it was true, it sounded ridiculous. Just take Mother and get out of harm's way. Please. Jarath. Her eyes widened. Please, Salah. Just. He took a deep breath. Please. You are my sister and I love you. I don't want you hurt. I am begging you, please take Mother and get out of here. Salah stared at him for a moment. Then she nodded. Okay. It was dark outside when the door opened again. He looked up, and then immediately started shaking his head. Salah. No. She walked towards him and pulled his sleeve dagger out of her belt before moving behind him. I'm not leaving you here. You're my brother and... She cut through the bonds on his wrists before moving to his ankles. You're my brother. She had to help him to his feet, and support some of his weight as they started for the door. They were almost there when the Grand Cleric entered, accompanied by Geldoron. The Grand Cleric shook her head. Mother Salah, I am very disappointed in you. Salah swallowed. Please, Grand Cleric. She turned to look at him, her eyes wet before they turned back to the other woman. He's my brother. Keeping him prisoner is an unfortunate necessity, child. The Grand Cleric sighed and turned her gaze to Jarath. The consequences were explained to you. Salah, run. Jarath straightened, letting her go. Run. He moved to block the approach of the elven man. And the man's eyes swirled with silvery light. Jarath hit the wall with enough force to black out. We will need a distraction. Salas said. Kieran's eyes narrowed, and then he nodded. General Gilmore will handle that. His eyes began to glow. Be ready. He couldn't have been out long. Maybe only a few seconds. The Grand Cleric hadn't moved. But Geldoron had Salah. One hand held her arms twisted up behind her back, and the other held a knife to her throat. Salah's face was a mask of pain and confusion. Grand Cleric. Her voice wavered slightly. The Grand Cleric walked toward him. She stopped a pace away. General Gilmore, I have tried asking nicely. She held up an arm, and several drops of blood welled up from a small cut. Let me boil it down for you. Her smile was cruel. Say yes or watch my brother skin your sister alive. Panic came to Salah's face. Don't. Jarath, don't. Please. Don't give in. Don't. He stared at the creature that wore the Grand Cleric's face and wondered briefly what fate had befallen the woman. And then he felt another presence, faint and familiar. The being that had been there with him when death had closed in. He heard the question in his mind and answered it aloud. Yes. Salah screamed a protest as the Grand Cleric touched her blood-covered hand to his cheek. And then he released the power Earthamil had provided, focusing it through his Templar training. Sivera was thrown violently away from him. He whirled, flinging the sleeve dagger into Geldoron's arm. The creature released Salah just as the door burst open. Then he staggered and would have fallen if Duncan hadn't caught him. Salah rushed to Jarath's other side. Duncan glanced at her, then looked at Jarath. His friend was pale but nodded to him calmly. He turned back to Salah. You got him. He waited for her to nod, then put his hand on Jarath's shoulder. I need to get to the palace. Go. I'll be fine. Jarath nodded. We'll catch up to you. He nodded, then started moving after Earthamil and Salas. Annabel followed a pace behind. Gavarin looked around the room and noted an Evan-Uris-sized dent in the wall. Salas wanted me to keep Sivera distracted, but I think you had it covered. He chuckled. Jarath shook his head. That was mostly Earthamil. I was just the focus. He looked at Salah and frowned when he saw the red marks on her wrists. His voice softened a little. You're hurt. She slapped him. Hey now. Gavarin caught her wrist before she could do it again. You said yes. You were going to let them stick a demon in you. Tears streamed down Salah's face. You would have. She threw her arms around Jarath and held him tightly. Don't you ever. Not for me, not ever. His fingers glowed white with healing magic as he cast the spell around the siblings. Then he glanced at Leandra. Let's get them to dash. Leandra tackled him, and he noted Jarath pull Salah down just as a spell exploded around them. Duncan followed the two gods, Annabel still at his side. Her sword and shield were held in front of her, and he kept his own bow ready. Salas abruptly stopped, and gestured. They split up. I think Sivera doubled back. Earthamil nodded. She did. Gavarin has it handled. Let's. He started forward again. The door ahead opened, and Geldoron stepped out accompanied by another elven man. Run. What? Duncan blinked. He exchanged a look with Annabel. Run. Salas echoed. Now. Running he'd kind of expected. That part didn't exactly terrify him, even as he and Annabel both turned to obey the order. No, the part that worried him was the part where Earthamil and Salas did the exact same thing. Chapter 8, A Sister's Sacrifice. Green fire lit around Gavarin as he flung a spell back. It didn't get through Sivera's barrier, but the elven woman staggered slightly. She started to gather another spell to her, and he felt a pulse of energy from Jarath cancel it. Sivera snarled in frustration. Leandra took up position, her massive sword at the ready. Jarath had shoved Salah behind him, and Gavarin felt a bit of frustration when he noted that the best warrior he knew was unarmed and unarmored. But still a Templar, and Jarath's eyes were glowing. Bloody hell, if Jarath wasn't still operating on Earthamil's power, they'd be dead already, statues of white stone. He flung another spell and saw the elven goddess step back. So, who was the second guy? Duncan asked. He glanced around the corridor cautiously but saw no signs of pursuit. Durnthel. Salas shook his head. And in a straight fight. We are now at a decided disadvantage. Earthamil looked and sounded very annoyed. What do we know about Durnthel? Annabel asked. He was often called the Beast, Earthamil replied. Why? Annabel asked. Before either god could answer, what appeared to be 10 feet of bipedal feline broke through the nearby wall. Glowing talons extended a foot from each hand, and the creature's fangs were longer than Duncan's fingers. The beast's eyes trailed dark purple fire. It snarled. Oh. Annabel said weakly. Leandra used her massive blade to cleave the arm from one of the summoned demons. Next to her, Jarath had managed to find a sword and shield. The sword, at least, was real and sturdy. She was fairly sure the shield was a decoration yanked off a wall. Salah had grabbed a candelabra stand of all things and stood in front of Gavrin, giving him what additional cover and defense she could. She was praying aloud as she did so. Gavrin was flinging spells while Jarath occasionally expended energy to cancel out the magic of the elven woman. The goddess, however, was starting to gain ground, and her smile had become vaguely triumphant. "Surrender, little Shems," Sivera said. "You are not without skill. Bend knee, and I will find a place for you among my chosen." "Bite me, you primordial bitch," Leandra growled. Hopefully the gods on their side would be finishing up with the other one and on their way back here soon. Sivera laughed. "You are wearing down already." She gritted her teeth. The problem was the woman was right. As strong as Gavrin was, he couldn't keep it up forever, and neither could Jarath. Frankly, she was a little surprised the man was still on his feet at all. She had no idea how much energy Earthamil had loaned him, or what could mean for what Earthamil was currently facing. And Mother Salah was no soldier. Though then again, she was a Gilmore. "Gavrin." Jarath's voice was tight and quiet. "Get ready." "Okay." Gavrin panted. His eyes flashed. Jarath spun, flinging his shield at the elven woman as he simultaneously directed his energy against her spell. What magic she had shifted to deflect the projectile. And Gavrin's spell hit her with full force. Sivera went through. Leandra smiled as she counted 4 walls. And then the bitch ran. Gavrin staggered, and Jarath caught him before he fell. Leandra shook her head, noting Jarath wasn't particularly steady on his feet either. His eyes were no longer glowing. "You boys are spent. Let's get you out of here." "Yeah." Gavrin nodded. "It'll take her a bit to regroup from that." They came around a corner to find Agatha knocking out a couple Templars. "Your Majesty." She shrugged. "Heard things going to shit, figured that meant you were around somewhere." She glanced at him, then looked at Kiran and Salas. "Okay, if they are with you." She frowned. "Why exactly are you running like hell?" "Because of what's chasing us. We need a plan." He turned. "You two could take them if they came at you one at a time, right?" "Yes." Kiran nodded. "Dernthal is one of the more lethal of the direct fighters, but with 2 of us we could outflank him. With Geldoron to back him, however. And in truth, Geldoron is the more dangerous of the 2. Dernthal's skills are limited to direct attack. He does not have Geldoron's range." Salas glanced over his shoulder. "He is the immediate threat, but not the larger." "Right. That's the plan then. Split up." Duncan said to Kiran and Salas. "We can't defeat Dernthal, but we can outrun him while you deal with Geldoron." "I am not certain that is a good idea, Delenn." Salas shook his head. "I am fairly certain that is, in fact, a terrible idea." Kiran narrowed his eyes. "Either of you got a better one?" When they exchanged a look, he shrugged. "Go kill Geldoron, then come save us." "Right." Kiran nodded. "Fenharil, with me." "Duncan, be careful." "Yeah." Duncan took a deep breath and glanced at Agatha and Annabel. "General Gilmore is never to know about this." He touched Annabel's arm as they split from the 2 gods. "Let's go." Salah bit her lip as she watched her brother half carry the exhausted mage out of the room. Lady Hawk took point, her massive sword at the ready. She clutched the makeshift quarterstaff she'd grabbed, her knuckles white. The Grand Cleric had been a demon all along. And it was Earthamil that had come to her brother's aid when. She shivered. Somewhere to the east, she could hear fighting. Dinaram's guard, her brother's soldiers, fought against the enspelled Chantry forces. She didn't even have that excuse. She'd just been a fool. Templars entered, and her brother pushed the mage towards her. "Take him." Jarath drew his blade and went to back up Leandra. Without shield or armor, and his body still exhausted by what she'd put him through. She supported some of Gavrin's weight. His hands glowed as he sent small blasts of fire against the Templars. It was over a few moments later, and Jarath took Gavarin back from her. Salah took a deep breath and started to follow when she caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye. A Templar was aiming a crossbow bolt at her brother's unprotected back. She shouted a warning as she stepped into its path. "Did we lose him?" Annabel asked. She glanced over her shoulder at the king. Duncan was a pain in the ass, but she couldn't deny he knew how to use a bow. He'd also been listening to her and trusting her to take the lead in the melee rather than getting in her way. Maybe he was smarter than she'd been giving him credit for lately. The floor in front of them exploded as the beast came through it to land a few feet from them. "No." Duncan fired an arrow that the creature batted away. "Gonna have to go with no. Run." Agatha kicked the door shut as they went through, then yanked on a bookcase to topple it. "Think that will slow him." She kept running. A crashing sound came from behind them. "Not for long." Duncan shook his head. "Head toward the cells, we can try one of the secret passages." "Right." Annabel increased her pace slightly to take the lead and smiled when Duncan dropped back rather than try to maintain the position. "He is toying with us." Annabel shifted her shield. The two possessed elves that had tried to block her path hadn't lasted long enough for him to knock an arrow. "On the bright side," Duncan panted. "That's why we are still alive." He laughed and gave her an admiring look. "All right, maybe you did earn that promotion to lieutenant." She rolled her eyes, then tackled him to the ground a heartbeat before the wall next to them exploded. Duncan rolled, and tried to clear the daze as the beast started towards them. Agatha was groaning, and Annabel tried to get to her sword. Then a woman stepped between them and the oncoming monster. The tip of her staff glowed faintly golden, and the beast stopped in its tracks. It stared at the woman. She just stood there calmly. The beast started to take a step forward before shaking its massive head. It turned and walked away. Duncan got back to his feet and stepped over to help Annabel back to hers before going to Agatha. "Thank you." The woman turned towards him. Her hair was raven black, but her eyes were a golden yellow. She gave him a contemplative look before nodding. "You are most assuredly Alistair's son." "I am." He drew himself up. "Who are you?" "You." A small smile came to her face. "May call me Morgan." Gavarin knelt next to where Jarath was cradling his sister's body. His thoughts went to Kylie, and he said a silent prayer that she was safe. He just wasn't sure who he was praying to. "I'm sorry." He couldn't even call what had happened a victory. They'd thwarted Sivera, but she'd be back soon enough. He doubted his attack had more than moderately inconvenienced her. And he had no idea how Salas and Kieran had fared. "Let me." Leandra went to help carry Salah, but Jarath shook his head and picked her up himself. They followed him out of the chantry. "Status." Duncan looked around the room. Salas and Kieran both looked frustrated. And Morgan simply stood there calmly. He didn't miss that Salas couldn't bring himself to actually look her in the eye. Clara Howe answered first. 4 dead among the guard, another 6 among the elves and 9 among the high ever forces. The enchanted Templars came back to their senses after. She glanced at Kieran before glancing at Gavarin. "Well, after the evil god monster things got knocked out of the fight. I'm guessing by your overall lack of happiness at the situation." He looked from Gavarin to Kieran himself. "Sivera and Geldoron aren't as beaten as we'd hoped." "No." Salas answered. "Though we have taken both out of action for some time at least. It will take Geldoron at least 2 months to recover enough strength to be a threat again. Sivera, however. Her strength never lay in a frontal assault. She sets traps, turns allies on each other." Kieran glanced at where Jarath stood silently. "As she attempted to do here." "And the other one?" Duncan turned towards Morgan. "He lit out quick enough when you showed. You should not have taken the risk." Anger filled Salas's voice. "Any of them could have killed you. I was in no danger." Morgan shook her head. "You do not have the strength to engage them directly." Salas glared. "And whose fault is that?" Kieran stepped between his mother and the dread wolf. "Enough." Morrigan barely raised her voice, but it was enough to silence the other two. Dernthal is no threat to me. She turned her eyes to Duncan. I must take my leave. Meryl, Danya, and I would have work to do. She smiled at him. Your parents would be proud of you. Duncan put a hand on Jarotha's arm. Jaroth swallowed. He took a deep breath. She didn't even hesitate. Of course, she didn't. Duncan nodded. She's a Gilmore. He blinked back tears of his own, then he pulled his friend into a hug. He felt Jarotha's shoulders shake. How do I tell Mother? Jaroth asked. You tell her that her daughter was a hero. Duncan put his hands on Jarotha's shoulders. Do you really think that part matters to her? My father was a hero. So were your parents. Did that make losing them any easier? No. Duncan sighed. I'll go with you. You don't have to. Yes. Salah was dead. As often as she'd irritated him, he wouldn't have been the man he was without her. There was little he wouldn't give to see her walk back through the door and start admonishing both of them for tracking mud on the floor. I do. Even if you weren't my friend, she'd still have been part of my family. I'm confused. Agatha glanced at Kieran. If your mother doesn't have the strength to engage directly, how come the guy that sent you and Salas running backed down from her? Dernthal did not back down. Kieran shook his head. Annabel blinked. We were there. She showed, he left. Agatha nodded. He declined to engage her. There is a difference. Had she chosen to fight, to attack him, it is likely he would have killed her. Kieran twitched a shoulder. He was simply unwilling to go through her to kill you. She didn't attack, so neither did he. Leandra nodded. But why? Kieran was silent for several moments, then he met her eyes. Would you choose to fight your mother, even if you were on different sides? Annabel made a choking noise. That guy was your brother. That is a matter of perspective. It would be as accurate to call him my cousin. And once, very long ago, my friend. Kieran tilted his head, his voice quiet and contemplative. But yes, he is the son of Mithil. So why was he one of the? Annabel frowned. I really need to study up on my elven mythology. Forgotten ones, Gavrin provided quietly. Yeah, those. Annabel nodded. It is. Kieran frowned. Complicated. The short story is that Elgar'nan banished Dernthal after Dernthal killed several of Elgar'nan's favored. And Mithil allowed that? Leandra asked. The long story is. Kieran shook his head. Very long indeed. So, we've seen 3 of the Forgotten Ones, but not any of the Creators. Leandra nodded. What else should we know? Most of the Forgotten Ones are weaker, with a few not much more powerful than the likes of Corypheus. Yeah, that's not as comforting a statement as you think it is. Gavrin shook his head at Kieran. Kieran sighed, and nodded. They are the ones that lost the war, and it is unlikely all of them will be working together. As for now, they are attempting to break new portals in the Banal Than. Once that happens, my father will not be able to keep the rest contained. Okay, so. Gavrin took a deep breath. How many of these guys are there? In total. Kieran met his eyes. 23. Oh. Leandra sighed. Well, shit. Chapter 9, Queen's Pyre. It doesn't matter what the truth is, Gavrin. The Inquisitor sighed. Believing the truth would shake their foundations. There are enough rumors in place that this story is gaining footing. Josephine frowned at her lap disk. So, half the world thinks I walked into a chantry and murdered a grand cleric at the behest of an old god. Gavrin shook his head. No, only about a quarter of the world thinks that. Brehon shrugged. Another quarter thinks you're a blood mage colluding with the Dread Wolf. He looked up at Duncan. There are factions in Ferelden vying for open rebellion, claiming the king has been compromised. Wynn informed me. Apparently, some of them are foolish enough to think she'll stand as their figurehead. Duncan folded his arms. The situation was beyond ridiculous. Who'd have ever thought there would come a day when he'd prefer dealing with the Tevinter than dealing with the Chantry? There are plenty who think the Thurin bloodline as a whole needs to be removed. Josephine set her quill down. You're saying they won? Gavarin glared. He leaned his head back, rubbing his neck before turning and kicking a chair out from under the table and dropping his weight into it. We kicked their asses, and they still won. They got what they wanted. Mafaratha's balls, don't be an idiot. Duncan turned to stare at him. Gavarin gave him a startled look. We're still alive, still fighting, so they haven't won shit. Gavarin, I've seen you break a Dem city in half and throw the Dread Wolf halfway across Tevinter, and you're going to let this little nose tweak get to you? You sent an elven goddess running for her life. This little stunt of theirs was because they believed they should fear us. Fear you. So, untwist your robes and show them just how right they are. He turned toward Ruya. It does matter what the truth is. You of all people should know that. You've been here before, with the world against you. We walk the path you blazed. I do not care who or what stands against us. He gestured sharply. I will not be idle while my world burns. Slowly, the Inquisitor nodded. Nor shall we. We are with you, and we will do everything we can to see to it this war is won. They all started to file out of the room. He started to follow Gavarin, and then Bruhan caught his arm. He raised an eyebrow at the spymaster. Your father would have smacked you upside the head for that speech. Bruhan smiled. After he stopped grinning like a proud fool. Thank you. Duncan chuckled. I think. You remind me of him. Bruhan looked him over. More and more every day. He nodded. Dareth Shirel, Delenn. 3 elven gods on the loose. Cassandra took a deep breath. 5, if you count Fenharil and Mythil. Uncle Gabriel folded his arms. And it is possible not counting them is a mistake. Mythil stands with us. Leandra shook her head. Remember the good old days when all we had to worry about was batshit crazy Templars and blood mages. Uncle Gabriel sighed, raising an eyebrow at Uncle Fenris. Well, let's be fair. Uncle Fenris flashed a smile. We still have to worry about batshit crazy Templars and blood mages. You know I hate it when you're right. Uncle Gabriel chuckled before turning back to Cassandra. So how can we assist the seekers of truth? Your voice still has power, champion. Cassandra nodded. At the moment though, we are at an impasse. The Chantry is in danger of splitting apart. Unfortunately, the Black Divine's unification efforts with Divine Victoria are more detrimental than helpful due to these circumstances. Pity Andraste can't do what Earthamil did and show up to give a helpful wave. Uncle Gabriel sighed. Oh. Leandra's mouth suddenly dropped open. Oh. She turned to look at her father. Carver nodded and smiled. You're right. Now would seem to be the time. He shrugged. Gweren. Loghain will meet you there. Right. Leandra turned back to Cassandra. Come on. Let's go get Andraste. Wait. Uncle Gabriel looked at her before looking at his brother. What? Gweren. Bruhan narrowed his eyes. He flicked his gaze to the 2 people who'd accompanied the others from Gweren. The woman was Dalish and met his eyes both calmly and defiantly. The man with her was more nervous. He stole it. And he took it to Gweren. He had it all along. He took a deep breath. We were there. We were standing a dozen feet from him. He stole Andraste right out from under our noses. Divine Victoria leaned on her desk. She took several deep breaths before looking up at the others in the room. And you knew this? Well, not the Gweren part. Gavarin shook his head. Actually, I was kind of playing a hunch. Leandra withered just a little under the Divine's gaze. I mean, it just sort of made sense that it went missing for a reason and that this was the perfect. She glanced at her father. You knew. Divine Victoria narrowed her eyes at him. You knew, and you kept this from us. Most holy, with all due respect. Carver drew himself up. You know full well where my loyalty lies. A Dalish elf and a mage. He stole the urn and gave it to a Dalish elf and a mage. The Inquisitor rubbed her forehead before letting out a small laugh. Who would ever think? Oh, for the love of... Bruhen ran a hand down his face as he stared at the mage. You're the linguist he stole from the tower. Well. The mage shrugged. Yes. The term he used was kidnap. The Dalish woman chuckled. We never. Divine Victoria turned toward Bruhen. We never suspected Anara. I'm guessing that's why he sent the ashes to Gweren. Lenore shrugged, then glanced at Bruhen. Remember that time you punched him in the face? Vividly and without regret. Bruhen glared. Duncan swallowed as he watched the flames begin to die down on the pyre. He couldn't help feeling just a little heartened by the number of elves in attendance. The majority were Dalish, come from the settlement. Painstakingly built alliances were holding, despite what they faced. He squared his shoulders and stayed until the flames were done. The office was unchanged from his last visit, nearly 2 years ago. Loghain nodded him when he entered. Your Majesty. Tairn Mac Tyr. He swallowed. I'm sorry. I wish I knew what to say. Thank you. Loghain took a deep breath, then nodded. When will be taking over the governing of Gweren? I will remain with the Order of Vigilance. Given the circumstances we face, I can do the most good there. He'd known what the man would say, and still it came as something of a relief to note he would not be losing his field commander. Jarath will be glad to hear it. He smiled. She did Ferelden proud. I know. Loghain returned the smile. You know you shouldn't be here. Loghain said as soon as Duncan left the room. This is exactly where I should be right now. The man hidden in the shadows shook his head. Loghain smiled and turned toward his father. She said you visited her. That you tried. Anders sighed. There was nothing magic could do, Loghain. I know. He took a deep breath. I know. It just... His shoulders slumped. It just doesn't feel real. This is still her Tairnir. Her castle. He straightened again. How is? We hold. Anders nodded. It's all we can do. He folded his arms. Even he cannot hold forever. Loghain sat on the edge of the desk, then straightened again as the memory of his mother yelling at him for doing exactly that sprang into his mind. He leaned on the wall instead. They can't kill him. We have that, at least. As long as there are Darkspawn, they cannot kill him. Anders bowed his head. And even then, there is still us. So yes, if necessary, if the cracks can be stopped from widening further, he can. And he will. Thank you for coming. He swallowed. His father took a step forward and put his arms around Loghain. Loghain rested his head on Anders' shoulder, and let the tears come. Tissalan nodded in greeting. Inquisitor Trevelyan. He gestured. Welcome to the University of Ferelden. The woman smiled. I've been meaning to visit for some time. Her blue eyes surveyed the fortress, taking in the additions. Looks much improved since the last time I visited. She turned toward him. Are you using the caverns? For training exercises, mainly. He inclined his head. Sadly, the students have realized the threat to have the dormitories moved there is largely empty. He gestured for her to follow him up the stairs. Gavrin indicated it as you we have to thank for assisting with those tomes we requested. Magister Pavis did most of the work. She stepped to the edge of the rampart to get a better view. He wanted to come, but circumstances have kept him in Tevinter. She turned to arch an eyebrow at him. You don't seem put out by Tevinter being an ally. The first mile of a journey oft seems the longest, but the path seems to be meandering in the right direction. He looked over at where a group of students were painstakingly assembling musical instruments. May I inquire as to the true purpose of your visit? Right. Inquisitor Trevelyan nodded. Gavrin said you could be blunt. She took a deep breath. The university is King Duncan's concern. You, however, are mine. Understandable. He shifted his gaze to where a balancing exercise was being performed. None of the students involved were any good at it, yet, but they seemed to be enjoying themselves. My half-brother betrayed your trust. I do admit to some bias in the matter. She sighed. How many know Salas is your brother? Half. He met her eyes. Brother. When she blinked, he shrugged. We share a father, not a mother. His mother was a noble woman. He touched a finger to his valislin, sketching the line on his face. Mine was a slave. To Arlathan, Inquisitor, Salas and I bore no relationship at all. Gavarin trusts you. Her voice was soft. He referred to me as Grandpa. Tissalan gave a small shake of his head, then glanced down at the students again. Several of my pupils picked up on the moniker. He rolled his eyes before looking back at her. Duncan trusts me as well, and... He inhaled. As strange as it seems to admit, the feeling is mutual. When she blinked, he smiled. Do you really think I would teach the ancient secrets of elven magic at the behest of just anyone, Inquisitor? I was one of the rebels. He spread his hands. I've been known to have a few problems with authority. She stared at him for a moment, then laughed. I believe you. What are you doing in here? Jarath looked from Gavarin to Loghain. They were in a secluded section of the Chantry Garden, and if he was not mistaken, they were hiding. Avoiding Cassandra. Loghain shrugged. She's still on about the thing. Jarath raised an eyebrow. About the... Gavarin blinked. It's the urn of sacred ashes. It's Androsta. I mean, it's... He looked from Loghain to Jarath, then frowned. And that doesn't actually mean anything to either of you, does it? He folded his arms. Don't you have faith? Oh, I have faith. Loghain shrugged. Gavarin, my lovely, I am literally a gift from a god. Gavarin stared at him a moment, then turned toward Jarath. How do you manage to deal with him every day? I asked Wynn's advice. She said to do this. Jarath reached out and smacked the back of Loghain's head. Whenever he starts talking. Does it help? Gavarin tilted his head. No. Jarath shook his head. Actually, it just seems to encourage him. Okay, I get him, but... Gavarin frowned. I thought you were Andrastian. I was. Jarath slowly nodded. And you're not anymore? Gavarin raised an eyebrow. What happened? Jarath looked away. I died. Gavarin swallowed. Oh. He exhaled. I don't even know what to say to that. He sighed, then took a couple deep breaths. Finally, he shrugged. I'm going to go see if I can scrounge some lunch. Want anything? I could do with some food. Loghain nodded. Be careful. You worry too. Gavarin started around the corner, hit something, and bounced off to fall backward and land on his ass. Gavarin. Cassandra took a step toward him. Are you all right? No. Loghain started shaking his head. No. There is no. He rubbed his forehead. No. Loghain. Jarath raised an eyebrow at him. Just no. Loghain kept shaking his head as he walked away. Wynn greeting Nugget with a hug. Hey you. Your graciousness. He grinned up at her, then the grin faded. I'm sorry to hear about. He sighed. It's appreciated. She patted his shoulder. Being called Terna is going to take some getting used to. Know that feeling? Nugget waved a hand. Bunch of the new recruits started complaining about Sergeant Jarath. I was about to make them do drills for disrespectin' the general when Clara smacked me upside the head and pointed out they meant me. Laughter escaped her. Maker, I'd forgotten you actually have a name. Me too. He spread his hands. We got that misunderstanding fixed up in no time. It's Lieutenant Nugget. Lieutenant. She grinned. Bet your mother was proud to hear that. Dedicated a whole new brew to the idea. He nodded. Got one hell of a kick to it. I'll try it out while I'm here. Felsey's Tavern was on her list of places to visit while in Denerim. She looked around to make sure nobody was in earshot, then raised an eyebrow. How are my brother's defenses? In addition to the city guards, he's got a full complement of Kingsguard now, whether he likes it or not, and he don't like it. Most guys, surrounded by pretty ladies, would be happy, but not him. Nugget shrugged. But he don't argue with the general about it either. We've even got a couple battle mages now to round it out. Couple elven ladies from that university. And you're on the Kingsguard. She raised an eyebrow. Loghain had mentioned that the Kingsguard had ended up mostly women with a fair mix of elves. Considering Qunari attitudes toward women and Orlshian attitudes toward non-humans, it seemed a nice, subtle way to thumb their noses. And they'd managed to direct the gesture at the chantry too. Her brother was getting a bit devious. Like I'd let them have a Kingsguard without me. Nugget looked insulted by the very notion. Someone's got to keep an eye on the king while the general does army shit, and that's what he's got me and Clara for. Right then. She smiled. I can see my brother is in good hands. She winked at him. Remind him that if he tries slipping his guard he's going to have to answer to me. The general already did. Nugget chuckled. Now that he knew, Duncan could see the young magi stir in the face of the Black Divine. Adralicus had given his life to save Loghain and Caleb. Without his sacrifice, they'd have likely lost the staff to Solas. And then they would have lost everything. Even without that knowledge though, he'd have found himself liking the man talking to him now, the man already starting to be called the Reformer. Slowly, I admit. The Black Divine nodded to the White. But we are gaining ground. It may be a few generations yet before we have eliminating the scourge of slavery entirely. After all, it still exists even in other nations, simply hidden away. Yet the very nature of the threat we currently face works to our advantage. The old gods of Tevinter stand alongside the old gods of the Elvaean to defend the world alongside no less than Andraste's chosen herald. It is a time for faith to be reborn. The Maker's first children return to him, to defend his second. Divine Victoria smiled. That one of those first children was entrusted with the urn has brought around some of the holdouts. I had feared the fact that Razikael was reborn as an elf would create problems, but that particular elf had a reputation long before his true nature became known. The Black Divine folded his arms. The remaining agitators are. He shook his head. Agitating. He laughed. It seems a slow day when I don't have my life threatened 4 times before lunch. He glanced at Duncan. You should consider increasing your own guard. I have. Duncan nodded. Or rather, General Gilmore has. Ah yes. He smiled. The Shield Maidens of Ferelden are already starting to feature in song and story. I hear all female houseguards are becoming the latest rage in Orlais. Well, it's not really authentic until you throw in a dwarf. Duncan chuckled. He still wasn't sure how he'd ended up with an almost all-female honor guard. Nugget was the only man in the group, a fact which had already resulted in the dwarf getting slapped a few dozen times. This tale of yours, your visit to the past. The Black Divine tilted his head. I would like to hear the story firsthand, if you would be so kind. It wasn't a true past, but an alternate timeline. Duncan slowly nodded. We met you there. Did you? He laughed. 16 years ago. He shrugged. I imagine I annoyed you. You did. He met the man's eyes. Then you died to give us the chance we needed. If not for that sacrifice, all would have been lost. He held out his hand. I didn't have the chance to do this then, so please. He smiled. Let me thank you now. The Black Divine, the leader of the heretical chantry of Tevinter, took his hand and returned his smile. My younger self undoubtedly saw what I see now. He inclined his head. Have faith, Your Majesty. I believe you can accomplish the task you have set for yourself. And we will do all we can to help. Divine Victoria nodded. Together, united, we can do anything. Leandra couldn't quite contain a smile. She'd been waiting for this. She bounced up a little on her toes to look. Tissalan raised an eyebrow at her, and she shrugged apologetically. Sorry, I'm just excited. And the ocean is wet. Tissalan nodded, then pointed. There. It took her a second to spot the griffins. Yes. She gestured for him to follow her to the flagged area they'd set aside for the griffins to land safely. As soon as her cousin had finished straightening her robes, Leandra grabbed her and picked her up in a hug. Oof. Sala shook her head. Maker, I think you've actually grown taller since the last time I saw you. She smiled. Come on. You need to meet everyone. She started dragging Sala toward Tissalan. Tissalan, this is Sala, your new dedicated healer. She's one of the best. You liked her before, you'll like her again. Sala, this is Tissalan, the headmaster here. Don't be fooled by his grumpy old man act, he's actually really awesome. They both stared at her, then she saw the other person she was waiting for. Kiran. She jumped up, waving. Kiran walked toward them. Is something wrong? No, everything is great. She walked toward him, linked her arm in his, and half-dragged him back with her to the others. This is my cousin Sala. Uncle Gabriel's daughter. She learned healing from Anders and she's one of the best in the world. She's agreed to come here and help out for when the students set themselves on fire. Is that? Sala glanced at Tissalan. Something that happens often. They are. Tissalan shrugged. Occasionally over-enthusiastic when exploring lost techniques. Twice already today. Leandra grinned. Thank you, Lady Sala. Kiran gave her a small bow. Sala smiled. This was not an opportunity one could pass up. Allow me to dash. Tissalan started to nod to Sala. Hey, Tissalan. Leandra pointed. My little brother is juggling swords again. Go turn your cousin into a frog. Tissalan finished. He shot her a glance that suggested he knew exactly what she was up to before rolling his eyes and heading in the indicated direction. Please excuse me. He's not actually going to. Sala raised an eyebrow at Leandra. You know, with him I'm not entirely sure. She shrugged. Kiran, why don't you show Sala around? She couldn't stop herself from grinning. Of course. Kiran nodded. This way, Lady Sala. He gestured. Sala looked slightly scandalized at the notion of being given a tour by an old god but followed. Leaving Leandra standing there, watching them with a huge smile on her face. Tissalan walked back over. Explain. What? She glanced at him. Delenn, I trust at some time during our past association I explained to you exactly how old I am. Well, you didn't put a precise number on it or anything but. She shrugged. Didn't fool you. No. He glanced at where Kiran was showing the grounds to Sala, then looked back at her. Then he smiled. Oh. Yeah. She grinned again. Perhaps later you could attend one of the lessons. He shook his head at her. We will be discussing the nuances behind the meaning of the word subtle. Yeah. I'm a hawk. She shrugged. We don't exactly do subtle. Check the description for the links to the author.